History remembers the wars we fight, but this one never reached the battlefield. In the summer of 1942, when the world was burning overseas, 8 men stepped out of the Atlantic surf and into the quiet edges of Long Island. No one saw them land, no gunfire, no alarm, just footprints in wet sand, and the sound of the ocean covering their trail. They carried cash, explosives, and orders written in code. But their mission wasn't to destroy cities. It was to test something deeper. How far loyalty could bend before it broke. Within weeks, they vanished into the machinery of American bureaucracy. Interrogated, documented, filed, and erased. Their story became paperwork before it became history. And at its center stood one man who did not betray his country, but betrayed his orders, and in doing so changed the meaning of obedience itself. Because this wasn't a story about sabotage. It was a story about conscience and how silence, in the hands of a government, can become the most powerful weapon of all. The Atlantic was dark and still, the horizon erased by mist and moonlight. Shortly after midnight, on June 13, 1942, a low shape broke the surface near Amagansett, Long Island. The German submarine U-202 rose from the depths, engines idling as its crew moved quickly along the slick deck. The order was mechanical, practiced, silent. 4 men climbed from the hatch wearing heavy boots and partial military uniforms, their faces lit only by the faint glow of a hooded lamp. Salt spray rolled over their gear as they loaded a rubber raft with boxes, shovels, and a collapsible metal cylinder. Within minutes, the boat slipped into the surf. Behind them, the submarine began to sink again, leaving no wake, no signal, only the smell of oil and iron on the water. The raft moved steadily toward the faint outline of land. Waves broke against the side, spraying sand and salt into the men's faces. The leader, George Dasch, kept his eyes fixed on the shore, steering by the shadowed dunes that rose beyond the tide line. Behind him, Heinrich Heineck and Richard Queren steadied the cargo while Ernest Berger pulled at the oars. When the keel scraped the sand, all 4 jumped out, dragging the raft higher up the beach until the sea receded from their boots. The night air was heavy with fog and wet seaweed. It was 12:10 a.m. They worked fast. Crates were lifted onto the dunes, wooden boxes stamped with stenciled numbers, tin canisters packed with explosives, and watertight containers filled with acid ampoules, detonators, and United States currency. The uniforms were stripped off and buried with the equipment. Civilian clothes were pulled from a satchel and thrown on. They had been ordered to wear military attire only for the landing, so that if discovered in transit they could claim status as prisoners of war rather than spies. Now, on American soil, the uniforms became a liability. The sand swallowed them along with the insignia of the Reich. The surf roared just beyond the dunes. Dasch signaled to spread out and move inland. But the first task was concealment. Heinck and Berger dug into the sand, packing the earth over the crates, until the spot was indistinguishable from the rest of the ridge. A faint trace of smoke drifted from a match, as one of them lit a cigarette. A small, thoughtless flare in the darkness. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. When the work was done, the 4 men stood together, breath visible in the damp air. The ocean gave no hint that a German submarine had been here. The coast was quiet, save for the distant roll of waves and the faint cry of a seabird. The mission they carried was defined in meticulous documents months earlier in Berlin. Operation Pastorius, an act of sabotage designed to cripple the American war effort from within. It had been conceived by Lieutenant Walter Kappa of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service. Hitler himself had approved it after repeated reports of American industrial strength reaching Europe. German factories were under strain, supply lines stretched, morale weakened by Allied bombing. The Führer demanded retaliation. If the United States could not be bombed directly, it would be struck through fear. Kappa had selected the men personally. All were German-born. Most had lived in the United States before the war. Their fluency, familiarity with American customs, and ability to disappear into the population made them ideal for infiltration. In early 1942, they were gathered at a secluded estate near Berlin and subjected to weeks of specialized training. They studied explosives, sabotage techniques, secret writing, and methods of disguise. They learned how to time detonations, to derail trains, destroy power stations, and cripple production plants. They memorized maps showing the vulnerable arteries of American infrastructure, rail yards, aluminum foundries, canal locks, and chemical facilities. No written notes were allowed. Every instruction had to be carried in memory. In May 1942, the first team, Dasch, Berger, Heinck, and Queren, was assigned to U-202. The second team, led by Edward Curling, would follow days later aboard U-584, bound for Florida. Their orders were simple but ambitious. Land undetected, bury equipment, regroup in major American cities, and begin operations. Targets included bridges over the Ohio River, hydroelectric plants in New York, aluminum factories in Tennessee, and railroad lines connecting industrial hubs to coastal ports. Each group would work independently, meeting only when necessary. They were supplied with $175,200 in United States currency to sustain a 2-year campaign of sabotage. On the beach at Amagansett, the fog began to lift. Dasch glanced toward the horizon, but the submarine was gone. Only a thin trail of phosphorescence marked where it had submerged. He turned toward the dunes and started walking inland, the others following. Their shoes sank into the sand, leaving tracks that would soon be erased by wind and tide. They moved toward a narrow path through the grasses, emerging onto a road bordered by pine trees. Somewhere beyond lay the small village of Amagansett and the railroad that could take them to New York City. Their plan was to split up, travel separately, and reunite later at a prearranged address in Manhattan. The sound that interrupted them was faint, a steady rhythm of footsteps against wet sand. From the direction of the water came a beam of light, sweeping along the shore. A lone Coast Guardsman was on patrol, his flashlight cutting through the mist. The men froze, half hidden behind the dune. The light passed over the sand, paused, and returned. The guard moved closer, puzzled by what he saw. Dasch motioned for the others to stay still. The man's footsteps drew nearer, until he stood just a few yards away. For a moment no one moved. Then after a brief exchange of gestures and tension, the guard turned back toward the water. When he was gone, the 4 men exhaled. They gathered their things and left the beach behind. By dawn, the Long Island team was on a train bound for New York City. They sat separately, reading newspapers, their bags filled with cash and forged documents. Outside, the landscape slid past in a blur of farmland and small towns. None of the passengers around them noticed anything unusual. At Penn Station, they melted into the crowd and disappeared into the city. The second landing, in Florida, was still 4 days away. Far across the Atlantic, Lieutenant Capet reported to Abwehr headquarters in Berlin that both submarines had departed without detection. He outlined the plan's strategic goal: to cripple American morale through fear and disruption, rather than direct destruction. Even a handful of explosions on a bridge, in a rail yard, or near a power station would provoke panic and force the diversion of troops to domestic defense. Capet's memorandum emphasized psychological impact. Success, he wrote, would demonstrate that America's mainland was not beyond reach. In the weeks before the operation, German intelligence had monitored American production statistics with obsessive detail. Aircraft output, in 1941, had tripled. Shipbuilding was accelerating. The Lend-Lease program had flooded Britain and the Soviet Union with supplies. Every report reinforced the same conclusion: the industrial engine of the United States was the decisive threat to Germany's survival. The only countermeasure available was sabotage, but the plan had already begun to unravel. The Coast Guardsman, who encountered the Long Island group, Seaman John Cullen, had returned to his station within hours of the meeting. Though unarmed and uncertain, he reported the encounter immediately, describing 4 men who had come ashore with suspicious cargo and had offered him money. His superiors dispatched a search party. By the time they reached the beach, the men were gone, but the sand showed clear signs of digging. A buried cache of German uniforms was uncovered, along with a supply of explosives. The discovery triggered alerts across the eastern seaboard. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was notified, and Director J. Edgar Hoover ordered an immediate investigation. In New York, Dasch read the morning papers. The story had not yet broken, but he knew the situation was unstable. He had begun to doubt the mission even before landing. The scale of the plan seemed impossible. The coordination required was beyond their reach. Surveillance in wartime America was already tightening. He knew that once one of them was captured, the rest would fall in quick succession. In Washington, reports from naval intelligence confirmed the recovery of foreign explosives on Long Island. Analysts identified the design as German. Within 48 hours, the FBI had assigned hundreds of agents to locate the men responsible. Passenger lists from trains, hotels, and ferries were examined. Descriptions were circulated quietly among field offices. The Bureau's objective was to find them before they struck. By June 17, the Florida team had already reached Cincinnati. Unaware that the FBI was closing in on the Long Island lead, they traveled openly, using their real names in some cases, believing that American agencies were too vast and uncoordinated to trace them quickly. They underestimated both the reach of federal law enforcement and the effect of Dasch's uncertainty. In Washington, Hoover followed each report personally. He understood the potential impact of the story if it reached the press. An enemy landing on United States soil, if publicized before arrests, could trigger panic. The investigation was to remain secret until all participants were in custody. The hours passed. Dasch remained in New York, alternating between caution and indecision. The money they carried was intact. None had yet acted. The Florida team, hundreds of miles away, began drifting north toward New York and Chicago. Across the country, no one suspected that 8 foreign agents were moving quietly among ordinary passengers. Back in Berlin, Kappe awaited confirmation of success. Weeks passed with no communication. Abwehr radio operators failed to receive expected coded messages. At first they assumed transmission problems. Later they understood the silence meant failure. On the morning of June 19, in Washington District of Columbia, a phone rang at FBI headquarters. The caller identified himself as a recent arrival from Germany. Using the alias Pastorius, he claimed to have vital information about an espionage mission, and promised to contact the Bureau again. The message was logged, uncertain in significance. Hours later, the same man checked into a downtown hotel under his real name, George John Dasch. He was alone, carrying a suitcase filled with cash and documents. Outside, the war in Europe raged without pause. In North Africa, Rommel advanced toward Egypt. In the Pacific, Midway had just turned against Japan. On the American home front, factories operated around the clock, producing aircraft and ammunition in record numbers. Few civilians imagined that the enemy had already landed within the country's borders. The beaches of Long Island and Florida soon returned to calm. Wind erased the footprints, and the tide smoothed the sand. The crates buried beneath the dunes remained undisturbed, until federal agents arrived weeks later, guided by the very men who had placed them there. In the hours before discovery, before betrayal and confession, before the arrests that would follow, the coastline lay silent again. The sea stretched out into darkness, concealing the route the submarines had taken back to France. Beneath the surface, the crews of U-202 and U-584 reported their missions complete. Their logbooks recorded the landings as successful. Onshore, in a hotel room in Washington, Dasch waited for the Bureau to call him back. The war had reached America's edge and stopped there, balanced between secrecy and exposure, between ambition and ruin. The first invasion of the United States in modern history had lasted only a few hours, invisible to all but one patrolman and the handful of men who came from the sea. The Atlantic winds swept the beaches clean by morning. The dunes held their secret under a thin crust of sand and silence. Berlin in 1942 was a city of order and exhaustion. The streets ran in straight lines of rubble and parade dust. The flags above ministries faded by wind and smoke. Inside the Reichschancellery, the machinery of war worked without pause. Reports arrived hourly from the Eastern Front. Columns of numbers describing loss in advance. Divisions destroyed. Oil convoys burned. Factories overrun. Yet amid the reports of victory and attrition, one message repeated in coded summaries. American production was multiplying faster than any calculation allowed. German analysts measured it with disbelief. Thousands of aircraft, tanks and trucks produced each month, material that could sustain 2 continents. The directive began as a handwritten note in the margins of a logistics report. The Führer's frustration was clear. Every tank destroyed on the steppe was replaced in weeks by one shipped from Detroit or Pittsburgh. The United States had become an armory without boundaries, feeding Britain, Russia, and its own Pacific campaign. Germany, constrained by blockade and attrition, could not match it. Hitler ordered the intelligence service to study how the enemy's strength might be weakened at its origin. The command passed from the Chancellery to the Abwehr, the branch responsible for espionage and sabotage abroad. In the Abwehr's headquarters on Terpitzufer, staff officers compiled options. Air attack was impossible. German bombers could not reach American cities. Naval bombardment would achieve nothing but loss. The only remaining method was infiltration, sabotage from within. The Abwehr had long maintained networks in neutral nations, but few inside the United States since 1941. The country's entry into war had erased all channels. Yet among the intelligence officers was one man who claimed knowledge of American habits, geography and language beyond any other, Lieutenant Walter Kappe. Kappe was 39, compact and precise in movement. His hair receding early, his tone measured. Before the war, he had lived in the United States for several years, working in propaganda circles, linked to the German-American Bund. He had returned to Germany with detailed notebooks on American cities, industry and immigrant communities. He spoke English fluently, without accent, and kept contacts among expatriates. When he presented himself to Abwehr Section 2, responsible for sabotage operations, he offered a simple proposal: to form small teams of Germans who had lived in America, train them in explosives and disguise, and send them back to strike at critical targets. The first memorandum on what would become Operation Pastorius was typed on January 15, 1942. It outlined a plan for 2 groups of agents to land by submarine on the United States Atlantic coast, one near New York, one near Florida. Their mission would be to destroy aluminum plants, hydroelectric facilities, and rail networks essential to war production. Each group would operate autonomously, equipped to survive for 2 years. The Abwehr senior officers reviewed the draft with skepticism. The ocean was vast, the enemy's coastline defended, and success would depend on secrecy more than strength. Yet Capet argued that the psychological effect of even limited sabotage would outweigh its physical damage. The Führer's order demanded initiative. The plan was approved. Over the following weeks, Capet began assembling personnel. He combed through records of men who had lived in the United States, but returned before or during the war. Some were machinists or mechanics. Others clerks or minor soldiers reassigned from frontline duty. He selected 12 for training, reducing the number later to 8. Each was summoned under pretext, told only that a special assignment awaited them. They arrived at a small compound outside Berlin disguised as a civil defense facility. The perimeter was fenced, guarded by plainclothes sentries. Inside, the recruits were introduced to instructors in demolition, chemistry, and disguise. The daily routine began before dawn. Lectures on electricity and fuses, practice in assembling detonators, exercises in constructing time delay devices, using acid and lead wire. The instructors were veterans of earlier operations in Europe, men who had sabotaged bridges and depots in France and Norway. Their methods were clinical. Each student was issued a manual on industrial structures and their weak points. They learned that an aluminum plant could be crippled by destroying its anode supply, that railroads could be paralyzed by removing a single joint bar at a strategic curve. In the evenings, they studied maps of the United States under red lamplight. New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati. Capet watched from the back of the room, correcting their pronunciation when they read city names aloud. By February, the compound functioned as a miniature version of the operation itself. The men were divided into 2 teams, each with a designated leader. The first was assigned to George John Dasch, a man of mixed record, who had once lived in the United States for nearly 2 decades. He had served briefly in the German army at the end of the First World War, emigrated in 1923, and worked in hotels, restaurants, and odd jobs before returning to Germany in 1941. His familiarity with American life made him useful. His lack of conviction made him a risk. Capet believed his obedience could be ensured through authority and surveillance. The second team was placed under Edward John Curling, older and steadier, also a former resident of America. Both groups trained together but ate separately, to reinforce the independence they would later require. They rehearsed landings on riverbanks and beaches, carrying boxes weighted to match the explosives they would eventually receive. Their instructors evaluated them not for courage, but for composure, the ability to act without hesitation, to leave no trace. Throughout March and April, the German intelligence network collected information on American targets. Agents in neutral countries supplied commercial directories and photographs of factories. The Abwehr mapped supply chains for metals and chemicals used in aircraft and munitions production. A priority list was compiled. The Niagara Falls Power Station, the Pennsylvania Railroad's Horseshoe Curve, locks on the Ohio River, and various aluminum plants in Illinois, Tennessee, and New York. Each objective was chosen for disruption value, rather than destruction scale. A single blast could halt production for weeks. Funding was prepared through the Foreign Exchange Office. American currency confiscated from earlier espionage operations was counted and sealed in oilskin packets. $175,200 in total, mostly in $50 bills. The money would be used for lodging, transportation, and bribery. Each agent was issued civilian clothing tailored to American styles, forged identity papers, and instructions for contact that would never occur. There would be no radio communication. Messages were too easily intercepted. Once in America, they were to function as self-contained cells. In April, Capet reported progress to Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr. Canaris, cautious and increasingly disillusioned with the regime, approved the operation with indifference. He viewed it as a minor initiative, unlikely to alter the war. His authorization, however, secured the necessary support from the Navy. Arrangements were made for 2 submarines to carry the agents across the Atlantic, UL-202 and UL-584, both commanded by experienced officers familiar with coastal infiltration. The mission schedule was set for late May. While the recruits continued training, the situation in Europe worsened. Allied bombing raids reached deeper into the Reich. Food shortages spread, and morale thinned. Yet inside the compound, discipline remained absolute. The men rose at 6, drilled until nightfall, and were permitted no contact with outsiders. They practiced assembling explosive charges blindfolded, learned to rig pen and pencil delay mechanisms, and tested acid ampoules that burned through thin copper wire after timed intervals. When not training, they memorized routes through the American rail system, studying how to move between cities without drawing notice. By the first week of May, the teams were considered ready. Each was briefed individually by Capet. Their orders specified that they were to wear German uniforms during the landing, a measure intended to classify them as lawful combatants if captured in transit. Once ashore, they were to bury the uniforms and equipment, change into civilian clothes, and proceed inland. The primary goal was to establish a base of operations in a major city, then select targets according to feasibility. No action was to be taken before consultation within the group. The men signed oaths of secrecy in Capet's office, each signature added to a folder marked Pastorius. The name was symbolic, chosen by Capet, after Francis Daniel Pastorius, the founder of Germantown, Pennsylvania, and the first leader of German settlers in America. The irony was deliberate. A German name planted in American soil again, this time under the banner of Sabotage. Preparations moved quickly. U-202 and U-584 were fitted with special compartments to carry cargo and personnel. Boxes containing explosives and timers were loaded in secrecy at the submarine base in Lorient, France. Crews were briefed only on navigation details. The agents arrived at the base on May 23 and were quartered separately from the sailors. For 3 days they remained below deck, forbidden from speaking to the crew. The submarines left port under cover of night, moving silently through the Bay of Biscay, before diving deep into the Atlantic. During the crossing, conditions were confined and tense. The men slept in shifts among torpedoes and fuel tanks, surrounded by the smell of oil and metal. They were permitted brief moments on deck at night, the sea stretching endless and cold under the stars. The officers said little. Orders were transmitted by code, confirming American coastal defenses were light but vigilant. German naval intelligence had charted patrol schedules and gaps in radar coverage. The chosen landing sites, Amagansett, Long Island, and Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida, were selected for isolation and familiarity. Both Dasch and Curling had known these regions years earlier during their residence in the United States. On May 26, U-202 reached the midpoint of the Atlantic. The weather held clear, the waves low. Inside the submarine, Dasch reviewed the list of supplies, detonators, pen timers, acid vials, and cash packed in waterproof bags. The captain maintained strict radio silence. A week later, U-584 departed Lorient with the second team aboard. Their mission mirrored the first. Coordination between the two groups would rely on timing rather than communication. Landings 4 days apart, travel inland separately, convergence weeks later. Back in Berlin, Capet sent his final report to headquarters. The language was formal, confident, stripped of speculation. It stated that 8 agents had been dispatched to the United States to conduct sabotage against key industrial installations, equipped for long-term activity. It concluded that the success of Operation Pastorius would depend on discipline and discretion. After sealing the report, he placed it in a locked cabinet and waited. The war continued around him without pause. In the days that followed, the first messages from Naval Command confirmed both submarines were proceeding as planned. There would be no further updates until they returned. For the Abwehr, the operation now existed only as a line in a ledger, and a hope that the sea would carry its agents safely to the enemy's shore. In June, the bombing of Cologne filled the German newspapers. Photographs showed entire districts reduced to ash. The air raid was the largest yet mounted by the Allies. Among the staff of the Abwehr, whispers circulated that sabotage against the United States was too little, too late. But within the narrow rooms of intelligence headquarters, the paperwork continued. Requisitions, supply lists, coded correspondence. The machinery of espionage, like the machinery of war, functioned on routine until stopped by force. Capet spent the following weeks compiling post-mission directives. How to communicate, if contact became possible. How to manage captured agents, if discovered. He filed each document with meticulous precision, yet none of the procedures would ever be used. Within a month, the names he had selected would appear not in reports of success, but in headlines announcing arrest and execution. For now, in early June 1942, the operation existed in perfect secrecy. The submarines advanced toward the coast of America. The Atlantic, stretching 6,000 kilometers between the continents, lay calm under overcast skies. To the German command, the mission represented ingenuity against overwhelming odds, the reach of a nation determined to strike back. To history, it would become a record of ambition undone before the first charge was ever lit. The radio log of UL-202 ended its entry for June 12 with a single notation: surface operations successful. Landing scheduled 13 June, 0010 hours. The ink dried under the red light of the control room. Above the submarine, the sea lay black and silent. The coastline waited, unseen beyond the horizon. A compound outside Berlin received the men in late winter and held them through the spring. The place was ordinary in outward appearance: a walled estate, service buildings, and a courtyard that could be swept clean of footprints in an hour. Inside, the facility was converted into a specialized school for sabotage. The recruits arrived under varying pretenses: labor drafts, reassignment notices, or orders to report for technical instruction. and were stripped of personal papers and loose contact information. Identification was reduced to a number and a billet. Guards in plain clothes watched the gates. The daily routine began with roll call before dawn and ended long after dark, and the hours between were filled with instruction, designed to sever ordinary habit and replace it with procedural precision. Instruction emphasized method over rhetoric. Lectures on chemistry translated into lists of reagents and reaction times. Demonstrations of timing devices were cataloged step by step. The assembly of an explosive charge was practiced until each movement required no conscious thought. Trainers who had performed sabotage operations in occupied Europe conducted the sessions. They presented task lists rather than manifestos. How to neutralize the safety on a detonator. How to produce a slow-acting delay with a glass ampoule of acid and a copper wire. How to connect electric blasting caps to field-wired batteries. Pen and pencil delays were shown not as curiosities, but as practical tools. An acid-filled tube, seated against a soldered joint. The joint dissolved on schedule. A circuit completed. A charge detonated. Each demonstration ended with the same command. Replicate it until you cannot fail. Equipment was cataloged and studied with forensic attention. Blasting caps, priming compounds, thin copper wire, coils of insulated lead, and wax timbers were displayed and handled under supervision. The agents were instructed in packing for sea and beach, how to waterproof paper currency and maps, how to wrap detonators in oilcloth and position them in crates to avoid chafing, how to camouflage a cache in sand so it would not catch a cautious eye. Boxes intended for burial were filled and then reburied on the compound grounds, repeatedly, each time judged by instructors to simulate the uneven compaction of a dune. The men dug, packed and smoothed sand, until their hands bore the grainy abrasion of labor, and until they could disguise a mound as if it had never been disturbed. Technical instruction extended to the structure of American industry. The small auditorium was converted into a mapping room, where charts and photographs of U.S. manufacturing centers hung on the walls. Trainees learned to identify the essential joints in a production line. The aluminum rolling mill, the electrolysis tanks used in metal extraction, the control rooms of a hydroelectric plant. Lecturers pointed to photographs of rail junctions and described the vulnerability of a curve or a switching point. The emphasis was not on the spectacle of destruction, but on calculated interruption. Remove a critical component, and a plant or line could sit idle for days or weeks, while spare parts were procured and safety inspections completed. Assimilation was an operational necessity. The men rehearsed civilian behaviors until manner and timing resembled habit. They practiced how to purchase tickets at a depot, how to present themselves at a hotel desk, how to tie a tie in a manner commonplace in American cities. Instructors drilled accents and colloquialisms, correcting pronunciation and cadence with exacting patience. The training regimen included observation exercises. Trainees watched windows in a mock street to learn what behavior attracted local attention. How long a delivery truck paused at a storefront before a curious clerk intervened. Which clothing combinations suggested a tourist rather than a resident. Personal grooming was managed to emulate American norms. Haircuts trimmed to regional styles. Shoe polish applied to match local street standards. Security protocols governed every movement. Recruits were forbidden to keep personal correspondence. Any letter had to be surrendered and burned under supervision. Conversations with civilian staff were minimized and monitored. Rules against note-taking were strict. No records left behind that might outlive a man's memory. The course required absolute memorization. Maps were studied until routes and sightings could be recited without paper. Names of factories and the configuration of their yards were committed to memory through repeated oral recitation and mock navigation. The pedagogical assumption was simple. A man who retained the map in his head could not be traced by a physical document. Practical field exercises took place both in the open grounds and in converted workshops. Recruits assembled devices under timed conditions and then disassembled them. They practiced placing a charge in a mock engine room and retreating along a pre-planned route, measuring the time until an instructor remotely detonated the device, using a simulated delay mechanism. Tests were scored on concealment, speed, and absence of traces. Failure was not punished theatrically. It was documented and repeated. Repetition bred a mechanical calm in hands that would later hold detonators and parcels of U.S. currency. 2 teams formed within the compound, each assembled to operate independently once ashore. The first team included George John Dasch, Ernest Peter Berger, Heinrich Heineck, and Richard Quirin. Dasch's selection rested on his lengthy residence in the United States and his practical knowledge of American urban life. He had the particular habit of observing rather than asserting. Instructors judged him competent, if reticent. The second team was led by Edward John Curling, and included Werner Thiel, Hermann Neubauer, and Herbert Haupt. Curling's demeanor was steadier and his record in prior assignments presented fewer irregularities. Where Dasch suggested flexibility, Curling suggested steadiness. Training of the 2 teams ran in parallel yet maintained intentional separation. They practiced identical techniques, but were kept from forming strong collegial bonds that might compromise stealth after landing. Shared briefings focused on method and objectives in the annex. Separate quarters and staggered mealtimes limited social cohesion. The design was procedural. Each team had to be able to operate without knowledge of the other group's activities, and to survive if members were captured. The instructors repeated that in wartime the only reliable asset was the plan, not the people. Instruction addressed logistics in granular detail. Travel routes were rehearsed, as if by a travel agent. Options to avoid main thoroughfares. Alternative connections between junctions, the times when ticket counters were busiest, and therefore less scrutinizing. Agents practiced purchasing tickets under assumed names, and rehearsed how to handle the natural curiosities of conductors and clerks. They were instructed in the use of bribes when necessary, how to make them discreet, how to hide notes in shoe linings or shirt hems, how to provide enough to secure temporary silence without drawing attention to excess. The training included mock interrogations, wherein instructors posed as customs officers or hotel clerks, testing reactions to probing questions and measures of composure. Medical preparation accompanied technical training. An instruction block on first aid covered chemical burns, the treatment of lacerations incurred during clandestine operations, and the management of minor infections without attracting clinical attention. Men were shown how to apply basic dressings, how to dissolve adhesive in alcohol, and how to stabilize a hand injured while handling detonators long enough to seek discreet care. The rationale was pragmatic. Injuries that required hospital care could reveal a man's origin, travel history or associations, and thus must be avoided or handled privately. Psychological conditioning was subtle and unsentimental. Trainers emphasized routine and attention to small details. A polished boot, a correctly folded map, the absence of cigarette butts on a hotel balcony. Patrol discipline required that men move in public spaces as if they belonged there, avoiding behaviors that would attract question. They were warned that novelty invites scrutiny. An accent, an odd combination of clothing, or the wrong brand of cigarettes could expose them. The objective was indistinguishability. No one at the compound spoke of glory. They spoke only of precision. By late April, simulations included full dress rehearsals of landings. Trainees boarded lifeboat mock-ups, weighed down with crates and waterproof wrappers. They timed their disembarkations to account for tide and moon phase. They practiced burying equipment quickly and efficiently, then erasing the evidence with careful patting and smoothing, until instructors judged the work indistinguishable from untouched sand. The instructors filmed some rehearsals on primitive motion devices, and replayed the footage in the lecture room, pointing out small hesitations and traces of human error. Each correction required repetition for elimination. Forged documents were prepared with equal attention. Identity papers were crafted to appear authentic to American standards. Driver's licenses, naturalization papers, and employment records were reproduced with the right typography and official stamps. Photographs were matched and resized to American sizing conventions. Each man was issued a set of identities, tailored to a plausible civilian life in the United States. Shop clerk, porter, machinist. The documents were bound with guidance on how to answer questions about allegedly common matters. The name of a local union, the location of a neighborhood shop, or the color of a public transport line. Trainers drilled these details until each agent could recite them without pause. Communication precautions dominated the final weeks. The abwehr forbade radio transmission once agents were ashore, deeming it too detectable. Instead, the plan emphasized the use of pre-arranged meetings and independent decision-making. Agents were instructed that if contact with command became impossible, initiative and discretion should guide action. The irony was explicit in training rooms, where maps showed only one route forward. Secrecy begets autonomy. Autonomy demands isolation, and isolation increases the risk of spontaneous error. Recruits were briefed on how to manage conflicting impulses, when to act, when to wait, and above all, when to preserve the cell's anonymity. The sum of training was procedural resilience. Each man left the compound transformed in small, measurable ways. Gestures standardized, methods internalized, knowledge transferred from paper to muscle memory. They left with the kit of materials chosen and repacked at the base. Waterproof sacks of money, acid ampoules sealed in glass vials, electric blasting caps cushioned in wax, a compact set of field tools. They boarded transport in small groups and traveled to the submarine base, under guard. On the night they left, instructors watched them load into trucks and noted each man's gait, each man's expression. There was no rhetoric, no rousing exhortation. The final words were efficient. Remember the plan. Do not keep notes, and trust the memory you have trained. The submarines waited at Lorient, under the cloak of naval routine. Crews made final preparations below decks, fitting compartments to accommodate crates of explosives and boxes of civilian clothing. Agents were given last-minute reviews of briefings and a checklist of procedural steps to be performed during the landing. Bury the uniforms, conceal the crates, change clothing, disperse. Capet filed reports and locked them away in a cabinet that, in time, would contain nothing to salve a failure. On the morning of departure, the agents descended below deck, with the same methodical calm they had cultivated. They were briefed on the hours of the crossing, the expected weather, the cutoff times for communication. Then the submarine slipped away into the channel, and down into the Atlantic, cutting toward the unknown with cargo that could not simply be returned. Training had achieved its aim in the narrow terms of the Abwehr's calculus. The men were prepared to land, to bury, and to operate. They were taught to value memory over record, caution over bravado, and camouflage over spectacle. They were instructed to obey orders without question, to use money as lubricant, and to treat civilian life as a stage set, demanding flawless performance. Whether these preparations would be sufficient against a vast and adaptive country remained an external problem, not a matter for the school. The compound's work concluded in the quiet of routine, crates sealed, maps memorized, identities assigned, and men moved into the dark, for a voyage none could fully predict. The submarines left Lorient, under the cover of night. With the quiet deliberation of vessels that had become familiar with secrecy, crews moved along narrow steel passageways, with practiced economy, passing stores and sealed crates without comment. Officers issued succinct orders, clipped to clipboards, and petty officers checked lashing points and watertight seals. The agents were escorted aboard in small groups, led below into cramped quarters that reeked of diesel and salt. They descended steps into a world of torpedo tubes and fuel tanks, laying their kit against bulkheads and acquainting themselves with the geometry of a vessel that would be their home for days. The boarding was methodical. Faces registered only the light of expectation and the fatigue of travel. No speeches were given. The last surface lamps winked out, and the submarine slipped from the harbor. The crossing reduced everything into schedule and routine. The submarines moved submerged by day and surfaced at night to recharge batteries and refresh air. The agents lived among sailors in an atmosphere of constrained civility. They were assigned bunks between torpedoes and food stores. They slept in shifts, rising to the metallic clank of valves and the periodic murmur of the diesel engines. Food was simple and functional. Thin soups, preserved meats, a portion of bread. Conversation was minimal and practical. How to stow a crate, how to secure a waterproof pack against the roll of waves, how to brace for sudden dives. Each man checked his rations and the condition of his clothing. The waterproofing of paper money was inspected, and ampoules were wrapped again and placed in double oilskin. The sea enforced compliance. The compression of the hull created an environment in which attention to detail became a matter of survival. Navigation was precise and cold. The captains plotted courses to avoid known patrol lanes, and to take advantage of tidal windows that would ease a night landing. They received only circumscribed orders from Naval Command: approach the U.S. coast at specified coordinates, surface at a scheduled hour, lower the boats, and make landing runs under strict silence. Radio transmissions were minimal, and encrypted with codes designed to present normal traffic. If intercepted, the submarine's logs recorded positions in careful increments. The crews logged weather and sea state with the same neutral tone used for mechanical checks. There was no rhetoric aboard, only procedure. Weather governed the choices of captains and dictated the tempo of operations. A northerly swell could swamp a rubber boat at the surf line. Fog could hide a landing from shore patrols but make navigation treacherous. Officers monitored barometric pressure and sea charts, with the concentration of men who understood that a misjudgment would strand men on a hostile shore. In the days before the landings, small consultations beneath hooded lamps weighed moon phase and tide tables. The selected nights promised manageable sea state, and moonlight slim enough to permit orientation without silhouette. On the chart table, a thin white pencil circled the approach and marked the exact minutes for surfacing and lowering boats. The men rehearsed final actions in the tight privacy of the submarine's compartments. They inspected life vests sewn into canvas pouches, ran fingers over the smooth glass of acid ampoules to confirm no hairline fractures, and tested the seals on cans of priming compound. Each crate was assigned a place against the bulkhead, lashed with rope to prevent shifting in a sudden dive. The agents checked their civilian clothing once more, smoothing seams and adjusting collars to ensure no telltale marks of foreign manufacture. The captains distributed simple orders in clipped phrases, pointing to charts and tapping coordinates. The men memorized the timing, surfacing exactly at the minute set, lowering the boats as quickly as the sea allowed, landing at a spot cleared on the map for its isolation and minimal patrol coverage. The transit across the Atlantic was long and compressed into small rituals. They navigated by the stars and by dead reckoning, measuring distance by engine hours and log turns. They passed ships whose silhouettes were noted and catalogued, sometimes altering course to avoid shadows that could carry patrols. When they rose at night, the horizon was an unbroken black, and the only light came from the instruments and the faint luminescence on the ocean's surface. The men moved like parts in a clock, each position and movement accounted for in a ledger of duty. Time itself took on the quality of a schedule to follow, and the approaching minutes of the surfacing were both an event and another mechanical checkpoint. On the night set for arrival off Long Island, the officers prepared for surface operations with a slow, concentrated motion. The batteries were charged, the snorkel managed, and the stern plane adjusted to ride low in the water for a silent approach. Engines muffled, the conning tower broke the plane and the vessel eased up, the deck glistening under a thin moon. Men moved with the economy of soldiers practiced in stealth, the agents descending into the hold with the last of their gear. The captain watched the chronometer and the chart, his gloved hand steady as he signaled. At precisely 0010 hours, on June 13th, the order came to prepare boats. The rubber skiff was hauled to the davits, inflated and lashed until the sea state allowed lowering. Everything else reduced to movement. Crates shifted, ropes checked, the final knot tied. The run to the shore was short and violent. The rubber boat cut through the low waves, the men leaning to counter the boat's roll. Spray cooled faces and soaked the hems of coats. They rowed in companionable silence, each man focused on the dark silhouette of dunes, lit only at times by a thin moon sliver. The keel struck sand precisely where the charts predicted. Men jumped out, hauling the craft high enough to avoid the retreating surf. The crates were carried up the slope, the weight of their contents heavy and immediate. They chose a depression in the dune line and set to work with shovels, lungs burning in cold air. They buried equipment methodically, testing the depth and tamping down the sand to disguise any sign of disturbance. Uniforms were discarded into oilskins and buried as well. Their insignia was rendered harmless beneath a few spadefuls of sand. The procedure was rehearsed under hand and breath. Bury, smooth, cover, leave no pattern. After the cache was concealed, the men changed into civilian clothes. Uniform buttons, shoulder straps, and insignia were stripped and packed away. The boat was dragged back to the surf and launched to be taken out to sea again. The submarine submerged without fanfare. The men moved inland by a narrow path, heading for a road that would lead eventually to a station and a train bound for New York. It was a movement of small, careful acts, each one designed to produce an appearance of ordinary travel rather than the evidence of transoceanic insertion. 4 days later, a similar sequence unfolded off the coast of Ponte Vedra Beach, south of Jacksonville, Florida. U-584 approached under the same protocol. The surface at the appointed minute, the silent lowering of a small craft, the brief violent run through surf, and the hauling of crates into the shelter of dunes. The Florida coast presented different geography, hard-packed sand, scattered sea oats, and greater warmth in the air. But the procedural rigor was identical. Men buried equipment and uniforms, with the same methodical thoroughness, tamping camouflage, until no relief betrayed the cache. The site selection had been chosen for isolation, a ridge seldom frequented after nightfall, and far from main roads. The agents moved inland, blending into the fabric of a small town, and then onto the rail networks that would carry them toward their respective cities. In both landings, the men paid attention to minutiae that might later be used against them. Brand names on food wrappers, the manufacture of shoelaces, the style of stamps on local newspapers. They kept receipts when necessary, and destroyed them when not. They purchased train tickets in cash, and observed the manner in which clerks checked identification, learning how to navigate the minor bureaucracies of American transit. The men split routes to avoid grouping their movements, scattering in small numbers, so as not to attract attention in crowded depots. The effort was not a matter of great cunning, but of mundane assimilation. Do not stand out. Do not draw question. Accomplish the transfer from coast to city with as little anomaly as possible. During these days of transit and dispersal, the submarines turned for the Atlantic and the long passage back to France. The captains recorded the landings in strict entries, dated and timed, and then filed the notes away in sealed logs. For the German naval records, the operation existed as a sequence of successful actions: approach, landing, departure. For the agents who had just set foot ashore, the operation now shifted to another set of hazards: public observation, the randomness of human interaction, and the attentions of local authorities. The sea had delivered them intact. The challenge ahead required different skills, persistence, patience, and an ability to dissolve among the masses without leaving a trace. On shore, the first moments after a landing were critical. Men checked clothing for sand and salt, adjusted shoelaces, and set a course for the nearest road. They observed the posture of residents passing by, the careful indifference of locals to the night's events. Where darkness had permitted the landing, daylight now presented another risk: the scrutiny of patrols, fishermen, or a solitary walker. The agents timed their movements for early hours, choosing trains scheduled at times when conductors were most fatigued, or station crowds thickest. They split into pairs and small groups, each carrying a share of the cash and identity papers. Their plan relied on anonymity and the invisibility of normal travel. The departure had been executed with naval precision, yet the true test of the operation would soon prove to be less about a seamanship choreographed beneath a moon, and more about the fragile probabilities of daily life: a curious clerk, a meticulous record, a wayward patrolman's attention. Order at sea had given the agents the chance to enter the country, but order on land depended on different contingencies, unseen and unpredictable. The men dispersed into the arteries of transit, into hotels and boarding houses, into the anonymous masses that flow through urban centers. Their departure from Lorient and their arrival on American shores would be recorded in logs and court files later, stitched into official narrative. In the immediate hours that followed, however, the operation lived only as a set of actions, whose future value would depend entirely on the resilience of human discretion. In a country now at war, the first U-boat surfaced off Long Island at 12 minutes past midnight. On June 13, 1942, the conning tower rose without sound. The deck plates slick from condensation. Crewmen worked without lights, lowering a rubber raft and loading the boxes that had been lashed near the forward bulkhead. Each container carried explosives, detonators, timers, and cash, sealed in waterproof packets. The sea was calm enough for a landing, the tide running low along the Amagansett dunes. 4 agents climbed down the steel ladder, stepping into the boat that pitched in the gentle swell. The submarine engine slowed until only the pulse of water against the hull remained. Once clear, the U-boat submerged and disappeared under a thin film of foam. The raft moved shoreward through fog. The coastline ahead showed no landmarks, only the pale line of surf and the outline of a small life-saving station set back from the dunes. The men rowed steadily, the oars making dull splashes. When the keel struck sand, they dragged the boat onto the beach and carried the crates beyond the tide mark. They wore field gray uniforms, stripped of insignia, except for buttons. Overcoats concealed the fabric until burial. The temperature hovered near freezing. Sand clung to their boots and gloves as they worked with shovels to dig a pit among the seagrass. Inside went detonators, blasting caps, acid ampoules, pen and pencil timers, wire spools, and several canvas sacks of American currency. The uniforms followed, folded and packed beneath the top layer. Each man tamped the sand with the back of a shovel and brushed the surface until the mound was level with its surroundings. The leader, George John Dasch, checked the time against his watch. The entire operation had taken 35 minutes. To observers, the beach now appeared untouched. The men stripped down to bathing trunks to disguise the landing as a possible swim, and began walking inland, toward a road known locally as Bluff Road. It was dark, except for the faint reflection of the sea behind them. A single Coast Guardsman, John Cullen, patrolled the area that night, on foot. His shift began at midnight, covering a 4-mile section of beach, between the Amagansett life-saving station and the nearby fishing grounds. At 12:30 in the morning, he noticed movement through the fog. 4 figures were emerging from the surf, one carrying what appeared to be a duffel bag. Regulations required approach and inquiry. He advanced slowly, identifying himself as a patrolman. What followed lasted less than a minute. A brief exchange, gestures, the smell of oil and salt, and an abrupt end, when the figures turned away toward the dunes. Cullen observed the fresh disturbance in the sand, but found no visible evidence of weapons or contraband. He noted the incident in his log, and continued his patrol. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he returned to the station, and reported to his superior, boatswain's mate Cullen. No relation. The officer recorded the statement, and notified the district headquarters at East Hampton. A small search party departed before dawn, armed with lanterns and carbines. When they reached the area described, the rising light revealed clear signs of recent activity. Footprints leading inland, a depression in the sand partially smoothed over, and after several minutes of digging, a buried cache of uniforms and German equipment. Photographs were taken before removal. The discovery established the first confirmed landing of enemy personnel on continental United States soil since the War of 1812. Meanwhile, Dasch and his team reached Amagansett Village. By early morning, they purchased civilian clothing, shaved and boarded the train scheduled for 6:59 in the morning to New York City. Ticket clerks recalled them later as quiet, paying in cash, carrying small bags. They arrived at Pennsylvania Station just after 9 o'clock in the morning, and dispersed among the crowd. The first phase of Operation Pastorius, delivery of personnel and equipment, had succeeded technically, but the secrecy of the mission was already compromised. At 10 o'clock in the morning, Coast Guard headquarters relayed a report of the find to the Office of Naval Intelligence. The Federal Bureau of Investigation Field Office in New York received notification by noon. Director J. Edgar Hoover was informed within the hour and ordered full coordination between agencies. The buried items were transferred to the Navy Yard for examination. Laboratory analysis identified the detonators as German manufacture, the ampoules as containing sulfuric acid, and the timers as consistent with Abwehr design. The uniforms bore no unit markings, indicating intentional anonymity. 4 days later, U-584 repeated the procedure on the Florida coast. On the night of June 17, 1942, the submarine surfaced 10 miles south of Jacksonville, near Ponte Vedra Beach. Weather was clear, with wind light from the southeast. The captain recorded surf conditions as favorable. 4 agents, Edward John Curling, Werner Thiel, Hermann Neubauer and Herbert Haupt, entered a rubber boat with the same complement of crates. They reached shore shortly after midnight. The landing zone lay near a stretch of undeveloped dunes backed by pine forest. Within 40 minutes they buried uniforms and explosives, marking the spot with a pattern of seaweed for later retrieval. Moving inland, the group followed a dirt road toward Jacksonville Beach, reaching the outskirts by dawn. They spent the day in a small tourist cabin rented under an alias and departed that evening for Jacksonville Station. Train tickets purchased in cash carried them north to Cincinnati. From there they divided two, heading toward Chicago, two continuing on to New York. Their orders were to blend into American urban life and prepare future acts of sabotage against industrial targets, beginning no earlier than July. The Florida cache remained undisturbed for nearly 2 weeks. Its location would later be pinpointed by Curling himself after arrest. The buried containers included blasting caps, delay devices, fuses, and acid vials, identical to those found on Long Island. In New York, Dasch's group occupied separate hotels to avoid association. Dasch and Berger registered at the Governor Clinton Hotel under assumed names. Hink and Querin took rooms elsewhere. They spent the next days purchasing civilian clothes and storing equipment. Surveillance records later reconstructed their movements through receipts and eyewitness testimony. Clothing shops on 34th Street, restaurants near Times Square, and a tailor in the Garment District. None of their actions drew attention at the time. By June 15th, the Coast Guard discovery had been relayed to all Eastern Seaboard commands. A formal investigation codenamed Pastorius began inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation's New York field office, led by Assistant Director D.M. Ladd. Agents compiled train schedules, hotel registries, and immigration files of German nationals previously residing in the United States. The Bureau circulated descriptions of possible suspects based on the uniforms recovered and the Coast Guard report of 4 men speaking with European accents. At the same moment, the 4 Florida saboteurs were approaching the Midwest by rail. Ticket stubs later recovered showed continuous travel through Savannah, Atlanta, and Chattanooga, with a stop in Cincinnati for regrouping. They maintained discipline, dividing the funds into smaller portions to avoid detection and agreeing on public meeting points instead of written notes. Federal Bureau of Investigation activity along the coast intensified. After June 16th, agents searched the Amagansett area for additional traces. They photographed tire tracks leading from the beach to the village road and collected samples of sand from the burial pit. A line of inquiry pursued the possibility of a U-boat base in the North Atlantic, but naval intelligence dismissed it as improbable. Instead, investigators focused on the probability of a second landing. Patrols were doubled along the southern coastlines, and the Office of Naval Intelligence issued alerts to regional commands, noting the likelihood that German submarines might attempt further insertions between Florida and the Carolinas. On June 17th, confirmation arrived that a fishing trawler off Jacksonville had sighted a submarine silhouette the previous night. The report, initially routine, gained significance when the Coast Guard in that district received orders to sweep nearby beaches. No further landings were detected, but traces of disturbed sand were logged near Ponte Vedra and photographed. These photographs would later match the location Curling identified after capture. Dasch spent June 18th in New York, contacting associates from his previous life in the United States and making arrangements for travel to Washington, D.C. Bureau. Files later indicated he had purchased a train ticket for June 19th, carrying with him a suitcase containing the group's funds and personal documents. By this stage, federal authorities had yet to identify him. His decision to move south would mark the transition of the operation from covert mission to criminal case. The procedural record of the landings formed the foundation of the later prosecution. Naval logs from U-22 and U-584 provided the German times. Coast Guard reports supplied the American confirmation. Together, they created a synchronized timeline. May 26th, U-22 departure, May 28th. U-584 departure, June 13th. Long Island landing, June 17th. Florida landing. Each event was cross-verified through captured documents, interrogation transcripts, and photographic evidence of recovered materials. Laboratory technicians cataloged every object from the caches. Each detonator received a serial number. Each ampoule was tested for chemical composition. Acid concentration measured at 91% sulfuric. Pencil delays were of the type manufactured in Dresden, their copper wires wrapped in paper, marked Zinder, 30. The money recovered from the Long Island burial totaled $82,000 in American currency, the serial numbers corresponding to bills seized later from Dasch's suitcase. On June 19th, Dasch registered at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington. Records show check-in at 3:15 in the afternoon under his own name. That same afternoon, FBI headquarters received a telephone call from a man identifying himself as Pastorius. The content of the call was noted briefly by the switchboard operator and logged as foreign national claiming recent arrival from Germany. The entry carried no immediate follow-up. While the Bureau analyzed the recovered evidence, field agents traced travel routes from New York City toward Chicago and Cincinnati based on rail manifests. The coincidence of foreign-born passengers matching the Amagansett description began to form a pattern. Surveillance teams in both cities were briefed to monitor hotels and boarding houses for recent German guests. Back on the Atlantic beaches, investigators finished excavation of the Long Island site. They mapped the coordinates and took depth measurements of the burial pit. The sand layers and contents confirmed deliberate concealment. Navy divers conducted offshore sweeps to determine if additional material had been jettisoned before landing. None was found. The recovered equipment was shipped to the FBI laboratory in Washington under armed escort. The Bureau's daily reports from this period read like technical logs. Entries listed times, locations, quantities, and chain of custody details. One such entry dated June 20th recorded receipt of one wooden box containing metallic implements consistent with detonators. Origin Long Island, New York. Another listed receipt of 2 canvas bags containing currency. US dollars, sum of 82,000. Markings consistent with pre-war issue. Each piece of evidence was photographed and indexed. In the following days, the FBI director required field offices to identify any German nationals who had returned to the Reich between 1939 and 1941 and who might attempt re-entry under false identities. Lists compiled from immigration records produced several thousand names. Cross-checking them against railway manifests yielded dozens of potential matches, among them individuals later confirmed as the 8 saboteurs. The procedural picture of the landings was now complete. Submarines U-22 and U-584 had executed their missions precisely as planned by the Abwehr. The American response, uncoordinated at first, was transforming into an organized counterintelligence operation. The physical evidence linked both coasts. The financial trail linked all participants. Yet to the public, nothing was known. The beaches of Long Island and Florida appeared empty, the tides erasing footprints each morning. The investigation operated in secrecy, while the saboteurs moved across the mainland, unaware that their presence had already been recorded, their caches catalogued, and their routes projected. By the final week of June 1942, reports from field offices across the eastern seaboard converged on headquarters. Each memorandum followed the same template: date, time, place, observation, verification. The documents, when arranged chronologically, provided the procedural spine of Operation Pastorius from its inception to discovery. The landings, reconstructed later in court, were not dramatic in sound or spectacle. They were mechanical events, precisely executed, rapidly compromised, and methodically investigated, each step documented in the tone of an instrument, reading rather than a narrative. The beaches where they occurred returned to routine patrols, their significance buried under the next tide, while the case built itself layer by layer in offices hundreds of miles away. The night patrol log from the Amagansett life-saving station began as a routine entry. Weather partly foggy, wind light from the southeast, visibility limited to 30 yards. At 12 minutes past midnight on June 13, 1942, Seaman John Cullen started his assigned watch along a 3-mile stretch of Long Island shoreline. The equipment list recorded a flashlight, signal pistol, and whistle. His route ran north from the station house to a wooden marker near the dunes, then back again at intervals of 40 minutes. The entry preceding his shift noted no unusual activity. The beach had been clear since midnight. At 12:30 a.m., he observed movement through the fog, a shape at the edge of the surf, indistinct against the dark water. Regulations required investigation of any presence on the beach after midnight. He advanced slowly, walking parallel to the tide line. The patrol report later reconstructed his approach from the depth and spacing of footprints photographed the next morning. At approximately 50 feet from the waterline, he encountered 4 men. Their clothing appeared inconsistent with fishing or rescue work. The patrolman identified himself, performed the standard inquiry, and was met with gestures he interpreted as confusion. He noted accents foreign to the region. His field log contained no additional description. At 12:40 a.m., Cullen resumed his route toward the station. On arrival at 2:00 a.m., he made the written report to his watch officer, Boatswain's Mate Cullen. The officer transmitted a brief signal to the Marichis Group headquarters, citing 4 unidentified persons, suspicious behavior, beach south sector. The entry went to the 3rd Naval District Operations Desk before dawn. The station commander ordered an immediate search of the area described. At 4:00 a.m., a detachment of 5 men equipped with lanterns and carbines departed the station in a truck. They reached the site by 25 minutes past 4. The patrol's official report, document CG-1342, listed evidence found: disturbed sand, forming an irregular rectangle 8 feet by 3, a metal object partially exposed, and multiple sets of footprints leading inland. Photographs taken under low light conditions show the outline of a buried container. The team excavated to a depth of 2 feet and recovered the first item: a waterproof metal box containing blasting caps, acid ampoules, and electrical wire. Further digging produced folded fabric, recognized as portions of military uniform. All items were bagged and labeled in sequence. At 6:10 a.m., the Coast Guard notified the Federal Bureau of Investigation's New York field office. The teletype summary read, "Possible enemy landing. German origin suspected. Evidence secured." A parallel message went to Naval Intelligence and the Eastern Sea Frontier Command. By 9:00 a.m., special agents from the FBI office arrived at the Amagansett station. They photographed the excavation, measured depth, and recorded coordinates by triangulation, using shoreline markers. Sand samples were collected for comparison. The equipment was transferred under seal to the Brooklyn Navy Yard laboratory. The first inspection determined that the detonators and timing devices matched those used by German saboteurs in earlier European operations. Each component was logged, weighed, and assigned serial identifiers, beginning with prefix LI-42. The site was closed to civilian traffic for the next 48 hours. Patrol coverage increased to 2-hour rotations extending 6 miles in both directions. The Coast Guard implemented temporary blackout conditions for the station buildings to reduce visibility from sea. Naval reconnaissance aircraft were dispatched to survey the coastline for signs of submarine activity. None were observed, but radar contact reports from merchant ships east of Montauk were reviewed for correlation. At 10:45 a.m. on June 13th, the first detailed report reached Washington. The Bureau's headquarters logged the event under file number 6553615. Subject line: landing of possible German agents. Director Hoover initialed the report and instructed Assistant Director D.M. Ladd to coordinate with Naval Intelligence. He ordered that all information remain classified until confirmation of the agents' identities. Public disclosure was prohibited. The official press releases for that day continued to describe routine coastal defense operations. Investigators began reconstructing the likely route of the intruders. The footprints photographed between the burial pit and the dunes suggested direction toward the Amagansett road network. Measurements of stride length and shoe size indicated 4 adult males. The first vehicle records checked for taxis operating in the vicinity produced no results. Most local drivers denied any fares during the early morning hours. Agents canvassed boarding houses and diners along the main road. Witnesses later recalled 2 men purchasing breakfast near the station after sunrise. The description, foreign accent, sandy clothing, substantial cash, was logged at 1:00 p.m. and transmitted to headquarters. Naval Intelligence initiated hydrographic analysis of the beach approach. Charts confirmed that the depth contour allowed a submarine to surface safely within 600 yards of shore. Patrol schedules were reviewed. The gap between 11:30 p.m. and 12:15 a.m., when coastal radar coverage was recalibrated, provided a plausible window for approach and withdrawal. U-boat sighting reports from convoys off the Atlantic seaboard during that week matched 2 vessels later, identified as U-22 and U-584. The timing aligned within a margin of 1 hour. On June 14th, recovery teams resumed excavation of the site for residual items. They discovered a shovel with German manufacture markings and several canvas wrappers containing soil traces consistent with coastal sand from Europe, indicating pre-landing packing. The evidence reinforced the conclusion that the landing had been premeditated and equipped by a state actor. At 11:00 that morning, the FBI's Chemical Division delivered a preliminary analysis to Hoover's office. The ampoules contained sulfuric acid and calcium chloride, capable of delayed corrosion of thin copper wire, a standard timing device used in German sabotage. The wooden boxes bore markings identical to those used by Abwehr Section 2. The conclusion stated, unequivocal foreign origin. Hoover's directive to field offices followed immediately. Every coastal FBI branch from Maine to Florida was ordered to coordinate with the Coast Guard for detection of further landings. The order specified inspection of beaches within proximity to rail lines and cities of industrial significance. Naval patrols were doubled, and merchant shipping received instructions to report all sightings of submarines or surfaced vessels. At 1:30 p.m., June 14th, the Bureau's Washington switchboard received the first anonymous call from a man using the alias Pastorius. The log entry summarized, male caller claims recent arrival from Germany, intends to report in person, will travel to Washington. The connection was terminated after 30 seconds. The entry remained unverified, but was attached to the Amagansett file due to timing coincidence. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard prepared an official chronology of events from the initial observation to recovery of evidence. The document ran 6 pages and included weather conditions, tide charts, and personnel rosters. Copies were distributed to Naval Intelligence, the FBI, and the Department of Justice. Each recipient annotated it with internal notes. These marginalia, preserved in archives, detailed the bureaucratic transmission of the first verified incursion of Axis personnel on U.S. soil. By June 15th, the New York field office had assigned over 100 agents to the case. Investigators visited train stations within a 50-mile radius, to identify recent ticket purchases to New York City between 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock a.m. on June 13th. Passenger manifests from the Long Island Railroad listed cash transactions by 4 male travelers, matching the physical evidence. The data confirmed that the suspects boarded the 6:59 a.m. train from Amagansett and arrived at Pennsylvania Station shortly after 9 o'clock a.m. Surveillance teams were posted in hotels near the terminal and along Broadway. The Coast Guard continued shoreline patrols while naval engineers inspected the dunes for residual traces of explosives. They located minor chemical residues consistent with nitrates, confirming earlier findings. The results were forwarded to Washington under the heading Physical Verification. On June 16th, a memorandum summarized the investigation's expansion. Coordination among agencies effective. Landings confirmed. Objective: identify and apprehend all participants prior to public release. The directive was signed by the Attorney General and distributed to the President's naval aide. Within days, the narrative of the lone patrolman's discovery became the procedural cornerstone of the case. Cullen's testimony remained consistent through successive debriefings. Investigators reconstructed his patrol route by pacing the distance and timing each leg against the logbook entries. Photographs taken by Navy personnel provided visual confirmation of the encounter site. His initial written report, typed on standard Coast Guard stationery, became the first exhibit in the military commission proceedings 2 months later. After the discovery, coastal defense commands implemented revised protocols. Patrol intervals were reduced to 30 minutes. Orders specified overlapping coverage to eliminate blind zones. Watch officers instituted new signal codes for reporting unidentified persons, standardizing procedures across the Atlantic sector. The Amagansett incident served as the model case. By June 17th, the Florida landing occurred, although authorities were unaware of it at the time. Information from the Amagansett investigation had not yet reached southern districts. The 4 saboteurs, who came ashore near Jacksonville, succeeded in burying their equipment without detection and boarded a train northward that same night. Their later capture would complete the circle that began with the Coast Guardsman's observation. In the interim, every item recovered on Long Island underwent forensic scrutiny. Fingerprint analysis found no usable prints. Each surface had been wiped clean. Toolmark comparison indicated a German-manufactured shovel, matching those issued by the Wehrmacht. Chemical residue tests confirmed presence of TNT derivatives. The laboratory maintained the chain of custody with precision. Time of receipt, examiner's initials, test result, return to evidence vault. The final analytical summary filled 32 typed pages and concluded that the material was consistent with sabotage equipment employed by German intelligence services. The bureaucratic escalation followed predictable lines. Reports multiplied, memoranda proliferated, and interagency coordination meetings were held daily. The Coast Guard's operational commander filed situation updates every 6 hours to the Eastern Sea frontier, which compiled composite status maps marking potential submarine activity. By the end of June, over 1,000 personnel had been briefed on the case under restricted classification. Cullen's patrol logs continued through the rest of the month, without further contact. Each entry bore the mechanical handwriting of routine, time, weather, tide, and the phrase beach clear. The notation of June 13th, however, remained the fixed reference point for the entire investigation. Every subsequent action, the deployment of search teams, the recovery of equipment, the coordination between agencies, and the eventual trial, traced back to the few minutes of observation recorded in that line. As weeks passed, the Coast Guard station at Amagansett returned to standard operation, though the beach remained marked on classified naval charts as Site 1, enemy landing June 13, 1942. The patrolman who had made the observation was reassigned temporarily to assist with demonstrations for visiting military officials studying coastal security. Photographs show him standing beside the recovered boxes, pointing to diagrams illustrating concealment techniques. His expression in these images is neutral, the demeanor of a man performing procedure rather than recounting heroism. By July, the initial discovery had become part of the administrative record of the Bureau and the Navy. Each agency treated it as a solved datum in a larger pattern of wartime defense. Yet, within the logic of process, that solitary patrol, one man walking a fog-bound shore, observing movement, and filing a report, had triggered an operation spanning thousands of miles, and altering domestic security for the remainder of the war. The final Coast Guard memorandum on the case, dated August 8, 1942, closed the incident formally. All subjects apprehended. Case transferred to military jurisdiction. Patrol protocols amended in accordance with directive. No further enemy activity observed. The file ended with a summary paragraph, listing evidence inventory numbers, and the simple note, originating observation. Seaman J. Cullen, 00, 25 hours. June 13, 1942. By the morning of June 14, 1942, the Long Island team had dispersed through New York City's dense traffic. Their arrival at Pennsylvania Station merged them into the crowds of travelers and commuters, indistinguishable from thousands of others, carrying small bags and briefcases. Dasch and Berger shared a hotel room, registered under false names, choosing a location near the main concourse, where transient guests came and went daily. Heinck and Quirin rented separate rooms several blocks away. Each man carried a portion of the group's cash, sealed in oilskin packets. The official purpose, to begin establishing a base for sabotage, existed only as a line in the Abwehr orders. Dasch managed the funds meticulously, counting the money at intervals and noting the total in memory. They avoided telephone calls and correspondence. Their cover stories, rehearsed at the Berlin training camp, described them as mechanics or sales representatives traveling for business. None had specific tasks yet. The operation's second phase depended on coordination, with the Florida team still en route north. Dasch spent June 14th walking the city, observing the pace of wartime America, newspaper headlines, recruiting posters, military police on street corners, and factories operating in double shifts. Every visible detail contradicted the assumptions in Berlin that American morale was fragile. He returned to the hotel that evening with an altered perception of the mission's feasibility. He moved through procedural tasks, repacking supplies, burning paper scraps, checking the money again, but without the mechanical conviction he had maintained during training. His later statements described these hours in factual terms, an assessment of logistics, not emotion. Objectively, his behavior diverged from the operational manual. Instead of reconnoitering targets, he began calculating the consequences of exposure. The following morning, June 15th, Berger joined him for breakfast. Receipts collected later by investigators confirmed the purchase: coffee, eggs, 2 newspapers. Both men read reports of heightened coastal patrols. The Amagansett discovery had not been publicized. Yet, the tightening of security was visible. Dasch proposed moving to another hotel to reduce the risk of identification. Berger agreed. They relocated that afternoon to the Governor Clinton Hotel under new names. Hotel registry cards later photographed by the FBI showed the entries written in different handwriting, suggesting Dasch's deliberate attempt to vary script styles. Throughout June 15th and 16th, Dasch maintained a routine of movement between locations. He visited clothing shops, restaurants, and train stations, sometimes without clear purpose. Surveillance reconstruction, based on witness statements, placed him in Midtown Manhattan on multiple occasions. His purchases included civilian accessories, a hat, a suitcase, and an inexpensive watch, items intended to blend with American norms. These details appeared mundane, but later became chronological anchors in the investigation. Meanwhile, the Florida team had successfully landed near Ponte Vedra Beach and begun traveling north. By June 17th, Curling and Teal were already approaching Cincinnati, while Neubauer and Haupt continued toward Chicago. Dasch and Berger were scheduled to coordinate with them in New York later that month, but Dasch initiated a different trajectory. On June 17th, he began liquidating part of the funds for personal use, converting several $100s into smaller denominations. His movements that day remained partially reconstructed through bank exchange records and hotel ledgers. That evening, he returned to his room and drafted a short memorandum on hotel stationery, later destroyed. In his eventual testimony, he referred to it as a list of thoughts regarding the failure of the mission. The FBI's parallel investigation was expanding. Field offices in New York and Washington exchanged memoranda about the recovered explosives. Naval intelligence confirmed the manufacturing origin as German, and Hoover's office issued orders to locate any recently arrived nationals, matching physical descriptions derived from the Long Island evidence. Yet the Bureau still had no leads connecting the saboteurs to specific individuals. On June 18th, Dasch purchased a ticket to Washington, D.C. under his real name. His travel decision was spontaneous and uncoordinated with the others. He informed Berger of his plan, characterizing it as personal business. At 0830, the following morning, June 19th, he boarded the Pennsylvania Railroad Express from New York's Penn Station. The manifest later examined by the FBI lists G.J. Dasch in seat 14C, coach class. The 6-hour journey to Washington placed him in the capital before 3:00 p.m. He arrived carrying one suitcase, the group's master fund of approximately $84,000, and several personal items. He checked into the Mayflower Hotel at 3:15 p.m., again using his own name. Registration cards, preserved from the hotel archive, confirmed payment in cash for 2 nights. The desk clerk described him as polite well-dressed, and unhurried. He requested a room on an upper floor. The Bureau would later note the irony that its headquarters stood only 3 blocks away. At 4:00 p.m. that same afternoon, the FBI switchboard recorded a brief call from a male voice, identifying himself as Pastorius. The entry in the logbook reads, "Caller states recent arrival from Germany, possesses information of national security importance. Will contact headquarters directly." The operator filed the note under routine inquiries. The call's brevity and lack of verification prevented immediate action. In his hotel room, Dasch organized the materials he intended to present: money, identification papers, and memorized details of the operation. Records of subsequent interviews and his own written statements describe a process of meticulous preparation rather than confession. He arranged the cash in stacks, separated documents by type, and reviewed the list of names associated with both teams. He remained in the hotel through the night, leaving only to purchase food from a nearby diner. Hotel staff later confirmed that no visitors were admitted to his room. The following morning, June 20th, he telephoned the FBI again, this time identifying himself under his real name and giving his room number. The message reached the duty officer at headquarters, who dispatched 2 agents to the Mayflower. Internal Bureau records describe the initial contact as routine screening of a self-proclaimed informant. The agents met Dasch at 10:00 a.m. and conducted a preliminary conversation lasting approximately 20 minutes. They noted that he produced large sums of U.S. currency and referred to a landing on Long Island involving German submarines. His demeanor was calm, his information specific. The agents returned to headquarters and reported to their supervisor, who ordered Dasch brought in for extended questioning. By noon, he was in a secured office at the Department of Justice building. Standard intake procedure followed: identification, property inventory, and transcription of his statement. Over the next several hours, Dasch described the structure of Operation Pastorius in chronological detail, from recruitment in Berlin, to training near Quince Lake, to departure from Lorient, to landings on June 13th and 17th. His information matched precisely the physical evidence recovered at Amagansett. The Bureau's verification began immediately. Agents cross-checked his description of the beach site against Coast Guard photographs. Measurements of distances between dunes and shoreline matched within yards. The quantities of explosives he listed corresponded to laboratory findings. When he named the submarine commander of U-22, the information aligned with naval intercepts. By late afternoon, Hoover had been briefed personally. The director ordered that Dasch be held under protective custody, rather than arrest until further corroboration could be obtained. Concurrent field operations began to trace the remaining saboteurs. Based on Dasch's account, agents established probable locations in New York and Chicago. Circulars were issued to field offices with names, aliases, and physical descriptions. Surveillance teams were dispatched that same night to addresses identified by Dasch. The procedural chain tightened over the next 48 hours. On June 21st, Berger was located in New York at a hotel registered under a false name. He was taken into custody without incident. His statements confirmed Dasch's narrative. Later that day, the remaining 2 members of the Long Island team, Hank and Quirin, were arrested in Manhattan. The operation that had taken months to plan collapsed within a week of landing. Agents documented each step with precision. Arrest logs included time of apprehension, property seized, and condition of the suspects. Interrogation summaries were typed within hours, each containing signatures of witnesses and agents present. The Bureau created a consolidated timeline, aligning Dasch's statements with verified events. The record grew to hundreds of pages, forming the case file that would later be submitted to the Attorney General. During the same period, the Florida team's movements were traced through information provided by Dasch. He described their landing point near Jacksonville and their intended routes northward. Agents in Cincinnati located Curling and Thiel on June 23rd at a hotel where they had registered under aliases. Both were taken into custody. 3 days later, Neubauer and Haupt were arrested in Chicago. In each instance, identification was confirmed through fingerprints and cross-referenced with the lists supplied by Dasch. By June 27th, all 8 saboteurs were in federal custody. The efficiency of the arrests derived directly from the information given in Washington. The Bureau's internal memoranda of June 28th attribute the operation's success to voluntary surrender and full disclosure by subject Dasch. The phrase became standard language in subsequent summaries. Forensic verification of the evidence followed. The cash recovered from Dasch's suitcase, totaling $84,000, was matched to serial numbers found on bills in the Long Island cache. The correlation established an unbroken chain between the confiscated material and the accused. The laboratory prepared photographic enlargements of the bill's serial digits for presentation in court. Dasch remained under continuous supervision During the interrogation period, agents maintained logs of his statements, cross-referencing details. With each arrest, he provided descriptions of the training camp, names of instructors, and structural information about the Abwehr. Analysts in Washington used his data to map German intelligence organization charts, later used in wartime intelligence assessments. The narrative of his surrender, though later simplified in press accounts, was preserved in administrative language. Bureau Report 1755, summarized. Subject voluntarily presented himself, furnished complete details of operation known as Pastorius, facilitated apprehension of all participants, and cooperated fully with authorities. It omitted motivation or speculation about intent. The Bureau's reaction after verification was logistical rather than interpretive. Agents prepared transfer orders, moving all prisoners to the District of Columbia, jail pending military jurisdiction. The Department of Justice coordinated with the War Department to establish a military commission for trial. Correspondence between Attorney General Biddle and President Roosevelt outlined the legal framework, citing precedent from wartime statutes. Dasch's cooperation did not exempt him from prosecution, but his treatment differed. He was held separately, provided with secure lodging within Bureau facilities, and used for intelligence debriefings. Transcripts of those sessions later filled multiple volumes, cataloging details of German intelligence operations in North America and Europe. By the end of June 1942, the FBI's procedural chronology of Operation Pastorius was complete. It began with a routine beach patrol, expanded through interagency coordination, and concluded with a voluntary disclosure that dismantled the mission before a single act of sabotage occurred. The Bureau's final report to the President on July 2nd summarized the case in 2,400 words. The first half described the investigation. The second half listed seized materials, $174,588 in currency, explosives, timing devices, and uniforms. The report ended with the sentence, "No property damage or loss of life resulted." The documentation, preserved from those 2 weeks, reads like a chain reaction of procedural efficiency. Each decision generated its successor. The patrolman's observation created a report. The report triggered a search. The search produced evidence. The evidence invited analysis. The analysis coincided with a confession. The confession produced arrests. In the accumulation of paperwork and verification, the intended sabotage dissolved into record-keeping. Dasch's surrender became the pivot of the narrative. His actions were later described in affidavits as rational, sequential, and deliberate. In the Bureau's perspective, his conscience translated into administrative data, an entry time, a signature, a list of names. The mechanism of espionage met the mechanism of bureaucracy, and the latter absorbed it completely. By the first week of July, the files were boxed, indexed, and transmitted to the War Department. The case moved from investigation to prosecution. The submarine crews returned to France unaware of the outcome, their logbooks recording only successful landings. The Abwehr, reading silence where messages should have arrived, assumed failure but lacked detail. Within weeks, Berlin received coded reports of arrests and executions, marking the end of its last attempt to carry the war onto American soil. The chronological endpoint of the investigation rested on one decision: a man leaving a hotel room with a suitcase of evidence and walking 3 blocks to surrender it. Every official document that followed, from the arrest records to the military commission proceedings, traced back to that movement. The act contained no spectacle, only the procedural precision of a bureaucratic pivot. It was recorded on a single line in the Bureau's master log. June 19, 1942. Subject Dasch appeared voluntarily. Washington, D.C. Information received verified. The coordinated arrests began the morning after George John Dasch's surrender. Field communications moved through teletype circuits, linking the Washington headquarters with the Bureau's district offices. Each message carried the same reference number, 6553615, and the instruction verified by direct observation before detention. Agents in New York, Chicago, and Cincinnati worked from identical memoranda, listing 8 names, aliases, physical descriptions, and probable addresses, supplied by Dasch. At 06:00 a.m. on June 21, 1942, the first operation commenced. Ernest Peter Berger was located in Midtown Manhattan, at a hotel registered under the name Edward Brown. Surveillance had confirmed his identity through handwriting comparison on registry cards and from the physical traits described by Dasch. 2 agents entered the lobby at 08:15, requested the room key from the desk clerk under pretext of maintenance, and conducted a silent entry. Berger was alone, reading a newspaper. The agents identified themselves, placed him under detention, and inventoried possessions: wallet, $260 cash, suitcase, civilian clothing, notebook, blank. He offered no resistance. The arrest was logged at 08:22. Within an hour, he was transported to the federal building on Broadway for questioning. His statement confirmed the structure of Operation Pastorius, exactly as Dasch had outlined it. At 11:30 that same morning, a second team moved on. Heinrich Henk, tracked to a boarding house on West 75th Street. Agents conducted surveillance from an adjacent doorway until the subject returned, carrying groceries. He was detained at the entrance without incident. A third team followed Richard Quarren to a garage in the Bronx, where he had sought temporary employment. Arrest occurred at 12:45. The Bureau's daily field report for June 21st summarized all 3 apprehensions in 6 lines of typed text, ending with the notation, "Subjects presumed, en route, per Dasch, intelligence." Simultaneously, field offices in Cincinnati and Chicago executed surveillance orders on passenger trains identified through Dasch's recollections. Cincinnati's Union Terminal maintained extensive ticket logs. Agents cross-referenced cash transactions against descriptions of 2 German travelers arriving June 17th. Hotel registries provided confirmation. The suspects, Edward John Curling and Werner Thiel, had taken rooms at the Hotel Metropole. A team of 4 agents entered quietly at 07:00 a.m. On June 23rd, detained both men and impounded their luggage. An inventory recorded 1 suitcase containing $15,000 US currency, personal clothing, 2 shaving kits, and a coded notebook later identified as containing memorized telephone numbers written phonetically. Their arrest completed the first half of the Florida landing group. 3 days later, on June 26th, Herman Neubauer and Herbert Haupt were located in Chicago. Haupt's parents' residence on North Francisco Avenue had been under discreet observation since a tip from Dasch indicated his likely return there. Surveillance confirmed the presence of a young man matching Haupt's description, entering the building at 20 hours 10 minutes. At 21 hours, agents executed the detention. Neubauer was found later the same night, in a rented room on North Clark Street. By 06:00 on June 27th, all 8 saboteurs were in federal custody. The arrest spanned 2,000 miles of territory, and 10 days from the first landing to final apprehension. Each arrest generated a standard packet, Form FD-302, interview, Form FD-303 property receipt, and a written affidavit signed by the supervising agent. Headquarters compiled these into a master chronology, showing the sequence of events in columns, date, location, time, method, and disposition. Photographs were taken under controlled lighting at local offices before transfer. Fingerprints from all subjects matched immigration records for German nationals who had resided in the United States prior to 1941, confirming identities. The Bureau's laboratory in Washington conducted parallel verification. The bills seized from each suspect were sorted by serial number and matched to those recovered from the Long Island cache. Chemical analysis of residues on clothing revealed traces of salt and sand consistent with Atlantic coastal origin. Experts prepared type certifications for inclusion in evidence. Each document bore the notation, examined and compared, authentic. The methodical compilation of data transformed the investigation into an organized ledger of proof. Transportation to Washington followed strict security measures. Beginning June 28th, detainees from New York, Chicago, and Cincinnati were flown under guard aboard military aircraft to Bowling Field. Each was restrained and accompanied by 2 agents, armed and sworn under special authority. The flights were logged by takeoff and landing time to the minute. Upon arrival, prisoners were transferred to the District of Columbia Jail. The chain of custody forms listed reason for confinement. Enemy agents, under wartime detention. The Attorney General's office assumed oversight that evening. Inside Bureau headquarters, analysts compiled a full operational summary for Director Hoover. The report opened with a timeline beginning May 26th, the departure of U-22, and concluded June 27th, the final arrest. The total length was 84 pages and included photographs, laboratory charts, and interrogation excerpts. Hoover reviewed it line by line, marking corrections in red pencil. His cover memorandum, to the President dated July 2nd, declared the case closed at the investigative level and ready for military disposition. The file passed to the War Department the same day. Interrogations at the district jail continued under combined FBI and Army supervision. Each session produced detailed transcripts signed by stenographers and initialed by attending agents. The subjects were questioned separately about training in Germany, submarine procedures, and intended targets. The consistency across accounts verified the central structure of Operation Pastorius, where inconsistencies appeared, principally in the estimated quantities of explosives. Laboratory data provided reconciliation. Analysts charted the correlations in tabular form. Item number, weight, type, subject reference, verification source. The Bureau's internal processes during this period operated with industrial precision. Incoming information moved from field report to index card to permanent file. Secretarial staff typed abstracts for rapid retrieval, assigning cross-references to parallel investigations of German espionage in South America. The past week's activity filled dozens of boxes labeled Sabotage, Pastorius, 1942. Each box contained a chronological run of forms, cables, and photographs. An entire narrative reduced to paper and numbers. The arrest phase coincided with administrative preparation for prosecution. Legal advisors within the Department of Justice reviewed precedent for trying enemy agents captured on U.S. soil. The consensus favored a military tribunal under Articles of War 81 and 82, governing espionage and sabotage. The President's authorization, drafted July 2nd, established a 7-member commission composed of Army generals. The Attorney General and Judge Advocate General's office began assembling evidence from Bureau files. By July 7th, the investigative function formally ended. The case shifted into legal procedure. Within the Bureau, declassification for internal teaching followed quickly. Training divisions produced memoranda titled Lessons Derived from Operation Pastorius, emphasizing the importance of local observation and interagency communication. The Amagansett Patrolman's report was cited as the model example of timely notification. Charts displayed at headquarters illustrated how a single field observation, transmitted through channels, led to the exposure of a continental threat. The system presented itself as self-correcting and complete. The physical management of prisoners reflected military standards. Cells at the district jail were modified for higher security. Steel shutters over windows, constant lighting and rotation of guards every 4 hours. Each detainee received identification by number rather than name during confinement. Medical examinations documented health status on intake, pulse, weight, and general condition. These reports later appeared in the tribunal's evidentiary appendices, contributing to the record's meticulous tone. The intelligence value extracted from interrogations extended beyond the immediate case. Analysts collated descriptions of the Abwehr's structure, training facilities, and operating methods. Charts drawn from Dasch's and Berger's testimony mapped the hierarchy from Admiral Canaris down to field instructors. This information informed subsequent counter-espionage measures within the Western Hemisphere. Memoranda marked, derived from Pastorius debriefs circulated among military intelligence divisions. Press management operated in parallel with investigation. During the arrest phase, public communication remained suppressed under direct instruction from the White House. Not until July 27th did the Department of Justice issue the first statement, acknowledging that 8 enemy agents had been captured before carrying out acts of sabotage. The announcement contained no operational detail. It credited the FBI with complete neutralization of enemy threat. The concealment of procedural specifics preserved the appearance of seamless control. The internal recognition came through metrics rather than ceremony. The Bureau's annual report for 1942 allocated a section to counter-espionage activities, listing Operation Pastorius as the primary example of success. It cited total expenses, personnel hours, and recovered assets, $174,588, explosives, detonators, uniforms. Each figure served as proof of administrative efficiency. The narrative of the investigation, stripped of contingency and chance, appeared as an algorithm, observation rapporteur de culture. By early July, the prisoner's transfer from investigative to military custody concluded. On July 8th, the commission convened its first session in a temporary courtroom on the 5th floor of the Department of Justice building. The Bureau's agents presented the documentary evidence in sealed envelopes labeled Exhibit 1 through Exhibit 237. Each envelope corresponded to an item on the master evidence inventory compiled since June 13th. The process transformed weeks of fieldwork into numbered proof ready for legal adjudication. The sequence of arrests and their documentation remain the most comprehensive domestic counter-sabotage operation of the war. In the final Bureau memorandum before jurisdiction transferred to the Army, a single paragraph summarized 10 days of activity. Subjects arrested without incident. Investigation complete. Evidence verified. Operation concluded June 27, 1942. The brevity of the statement belied the scale of coordination it represented. Behind the administrative clarity lay the physical evidence of the roundup, photographs, boxes, and recorded statements occupying shelves in Bureau storage. Each arrest contributed another layer of verification, until the investigation resembled a closed mechanical system. The original intent of the saboteurs, to disrupt the machinery of production, had inverted. Their failure reinforced the machinery of surveillance. Every procedural act documented their existence into disappearance. By mid-July, the Bureau returned to routine operations. The file labeled Pastorius remained classified, its contents sealed under wartime secrecy. The agents involved were reassigned to counterintelligence units, monitoring industrial security, and coastal defense. The case that had begun with footprints in wet sand ended with index cards in metal drawers. The roundup stood complete. 8 men arrested, evidence cataloged, a bureaucratic sequence perfected to conclusion. The transfer to military custody began under direct presidential order. At 02 o'clock on July 8, 1942, The 8 prisoners were escorted from the district jail to a newly secured courtroom within the Department of Justice building. The 5th-floor chamber, ordinarily used for administrative hearings, had been converted overnight into a sealed military venue. Windows were covered in heavy canvas, floors reinforced with additional guards, and a continuous perimeter established by armed sentries from the military police corps. Entrance required written authorization, countersigned by both the Attorney General and the Judge Advocate General. The courtroom arrangement followed the plan approved by the War Department. A raised platform held the 7-member military commission, Major General Frank R. McCoy, President Major Generals Walter S. Grant, Lorenzo D. Gasser, Blanton Winship, and Brigadier Generals Guy V. Henry, John T. Kennedy, and John T. Lewis. Facing them stood the defense table for the accused and their counsel, Colonel Kenneth C. Royal and Major Lawson H. Stone, uniformed officers assigned to represent all 8 defendants. At the opposing table, the prosecution team included Attorney General Francis Biddle and Major General Myron C. Kramer, Judge Advocate General of the Army. A single court reporter occupied a central desk, recording proceedings in shorthand for later transcription. Proceedings opened at 10:00 a.m. The record labeled the session as United States versus Herbert Haupt et al. The charges read, violating the law of war, the Articles of War 81 and 82, and the law of the United States, entering the United States from a belligerent nation in time of war, for the purpose of sabotage, espionage, and hostile acts. Each defendant stood in turn, as his name was called. No statement of plea was entered beyond acknowledgement of identity. The tribunal operated outside civilian court jurisdiction, governed instead by presidential proclamation, establishing military authority over unlawful enemy combatants. Defense counsel focused on the distinction between spies and soldiers. They argued that the defendants had landed in uniform, and therefore qualified as prisoners of war, under the Geneva Convention. The prosecution countered with evidence that the uniforms had been discarded before contact with U.S. forces, and that the men subsequently operated in civilian clothing, with intent to conceal identity. The legal debate occupied 3 days of sessions, but altered no procedural course. The commission ruled that by entering clandestinely with intent to sabotage, they had forfeited combatant status, and were subject to trial by military authority. Transcripts show the tempo of the proceedings as methodical and unbroken. Each witness identified documents, gave location, date, and signature, then stepped down. The court reporter typed continuously, filling stacks of paper that were numbered and indexed each night. Every evening, the presiding general signed the daily minutes, sealing them in envelopes, for transport to the Judge Advocate General's office. The secrecy surrounding the tribunal was absolute. Even within the Department of Justice, only select officials knew the nature of the hearings taking place behind locked doors. On July 18th, the prosecution concluded its presentation with a summary of evidence linking each defendant to the German sabotage plan. Charts displayed the chain of command from Berlin to the Abwehr headquarters at Queens Lake, through Lieutenant Walter Kappe, and finally to the 2 submarine crews. Each defendant's name appeared under a column marked operative. The visual demonstration illustrated that the mission represented an organized military action, directed by the German government. The defense then presented its case. Royal and Stone argued collective coercion, and attempted to distinguish between those who had initiated the surrender and those who had merely followed orders. They entered affidavits attesting that Dasch and Berger had voluntarily disclosed the mission to American authorities, preventing any act of sabotage. The prosecution did not contest the cooperation, but maintained that all 8 were guilty under wartime law, regardless of motive. The commission allowed the record to include notes on each defendant's behavior following landing, but not as grounds for acquittal. Throughout the proceedings, security officers monitored every movement of the accused. During recess, they were escorted to holding cells within the building under constant guard. Meals were brought individually. Contact among prisoners was prohibited. Medical officers inspected them daily and filed reports noting physical condition satisfactory, morale stable. The record presents an image of complete administrative control. The tribunal operated without public presence. Only at its conclusion would the existence of the trial become known. This secrecy allowed uninterrupted coordination between military and civilian branches. Attorney General Biddle's internal memoranda described the atmosphere as quiet efficiency, under full authority of the Commander-in-Chief. Each procedural decision, from admission of evidence to ruling on objections, followed Army legal manuals, with rulings entered immediately in writing. By July 31, testimony had closed. The court recessed for deliberation. The generals withdrew to a secured conference room, where stenographers were excluded. Notes from the Judge Advocate General's office reconstruct the deliberations, only in outline, review of charges, confirmation of jurisdiction, evaluation of mitigating factors for Dasch and Berger, and determination of sentence. After 3 days, the commission reached a unanimous decision. On August 3, the tribunal reconvened for formal reading of findings. The judgment sheet lists all 8 names, followed by the word guilty. Sentences: 6 Death by electrocution. 1 life imprisonment. 1 30 years imprisonment. The record notes that the decision was immediately forwarded to the president for review as required by military procedure. The commission then adjourned permanently. President Roosevelt examined the case summary the following day. The recommendation from Attorney General Biddle urged clemency for Dasch and Berger on grounds of cooperation and voluntary disclosure. The president concurred, endorsing the sentences as modified. Dasch, 30 years. Berger, life imprisonment. The remaining 6 execution. His approval was signed August 7, 1942. Copies were transmitted to the War Department and the district jail. Preparations for execution began that same evening under supervision of the Army Provost Marshal. The designated location was the District of Columbia Jail Execution Chamber, retrofitted for military use. Electrical engineers tested equipment. Medical officers certified readiness. The execution order scheduled implementation for the following morning, August 8, beginning at 12:01 a.m. At the appointed hour, the condemned men were brought individually into the chamber. Each procedure followed exact military protocol: identity confirmation, medical inspection, attachment of electrodes, certification of time of death by attending physicians. The entire process concluded at 1:32 a.m. Official witnesses included the Provost Marshal, a representative of the Judge Advocate General, and the prison warden. Death certificates listed cause as execution pursuant to military sentence. Afterward, the bodies were photographed for record and interred in unmarked graves within the jail cemetery. Following the executions, the remaining 2 prisoners were transferred under heavy guard to federal penitentiaries: Berger to Leavenworth, Kansas, and Dasch to Atlanta, Georgia. Their custody records noted to serve remainder of life, term of 30 years, per presidential order. The tribunal's documentation filled 34 bound volumes, totaling more than 3,000 pages. Each contained transcripts, exhibits, and appendices. Volume 1 held the President's proclamation authorizing the commission. Volume 2, procedural rules. Volumes 3 through 33, verbatim testimony. Volume 34, verdict and administrative correspondence. The set was sealed as top secret and stored in the archives of the Judge Advocate General. Copies were distributed only to the President, the Attorney General, and the Secretary of War. The public announcement occurred on August 8, hours after the executions. The White House press release, drafted by Biddle's office, stated simply, 8 saboteurs, agents of the German government, were convicted before a military commission of violating the law of war. 6 were executed today. 2 received prison sentences. Justice has been done swiftly, and in accordance with the Constitution and the laws of war. The release omitted names of the executioners, specific methods, and locations. Reaction within government circles emphasized administrative success. The War Department's after-action report concluded, military commission procedure demonstrated effectiveness of immediate wartime justice under executive authority. Hoover's memorandum to field offices praised the Bureau's investigation, listing Operation Pastorius as proof of coordinated intelligence efficiency. The internal circulation of commendations was extensive, each emphasizing precision and speed. In the following weeks, the tribunal's sealed transcripts underwent selective declassification for use in training courses on military law. Lectures at the Army War College presented the trial as precedent for handling unlawful combatants. Diagrams reconstructed the layout of the courtroom, the flow of evidence, and the hierarchy of command approvals leading to the president's signature. The analytical tone removed all human dimension, replacing individual fates with procedural sequence. The narrative of the tribunal, when reconstructed later from official sources, reads as a mechanical progression of authority. Each step followed logically from the previous one: discovery, investigation, arrest, prosecution, judgment, execution. The machinery of law absorbed the machinery of espionage. No act of sabotage had occurred, yet the full weight of wartime jurisprudence descended to demonstrate control. Within 2 weeks, the courtroom on the 5th floor returned to its former administrative function. The benches were removed, windows uncovered, and guards reassigned. The only trace of the tribunal's existence remained in the confidential files of the War Department. Those files, indexed by reference number and sealed, completed the procedural arc that had begun with a patrolman's report on a fog-covered beach 56 days earlier. The executions at the District of Columbia Jail ended before dawn on August 8, 1942. By 2 o'clock, the building had returned to silence. Within the hour, certified statements of completion were delivered by courier to the Judge Advocate General's office and the White House. The Army Provost Marshal filed the final report listing names, times, and witnesses. Photographs of the chamber and the remains were sealed in a locked envelope, marked classified, not for release. The process that had begun 56 days earlier was now officially complete. At 9 o'clock that same morning, the Department of Justice distributed a public communiqué. It confirmed that 6 enemy agents had been executed, following conviction by a military commission, and that 2 others were imprisoned. The release occupied a single paragraph in the press bulletins of the day. Wire services transmitted it to newspapers nationwide. Front-page headlines appeared by evening editions. 6 Nazi spies die in electric chair. The coverage repeated the government's phrasing, almost verbatim. No details of the trial, evidence or location, were disclosed. The secrecy held perfectly. Inside the Bureau, Hoover issued an internal circular congratulating all divisions for their efficiency and discretion. He emphasized that the investigation had prevented enemy action on American soil and demonstrated the capacity of coordinated federal agencies to protect the homeland. The memo was logged, copied to regional directors, and filed under Administrative Achievements, 1942. Within days, case agents were reassigned to routine counter-espionage work. The active file Pastorius was transferred to storage. Across Washington, legal departments began preparing summaries for historical and judicial record. The president's authorization for the commission had raised constitutional questions even within the government. On July 29, while the tribunal was still underway, petitions for writs of habeas corpus had been filed on behalf of the prisoners, challenging the legality of their trial by military court. The Supreme Court had convened in special session, heard arguments in closed chamber, and on July 31 unanimously denied the petitions. The decision itself was withheld pending security review. 3 months later, in October 1942, the court released its full opinion under the title, Ex parte Quirin. The document ran 42 pages, and became the definitive legal precedent on the authority of the president to establish military commissions for unlawful enemy combatants. The opinion distinguished between lawful soldiers and agents who violated the laws of war by entering in civilian disguise. The justices upheld every action of the executive branch. The tone was clinical, the reasoning direct. The decision formalized what had already been carried out. In Germany, the Abwehr received only fragmentary information about the outcome. Intelligence channels that had expected reports from the Saboteurs fell silent. Radio intercepts confirmed that none of the codes associated with Operation Pastorius were active. By autumn 1942, Admiral Canaris ordered termination of all sabotage projects targeting the United States. Subsequent Abwehr memoranda noted the loss of 2 U-boats for a mission yielding no results. The entire concept of inserting agents by submarine was judged untenable. No further attempts were authorized. Inside American intelligence circles, the case became a model for interagency coordination. The Navy, FBI, and War Department conducted a post-operation analysis entitled Combined Report on Operation Pastorius. It documented the initial detection by the Coast Guard, the investigation workflow, and the legal procedures culminating in execution. Charts measured elapsed time between events: discovery to arrest, 14 days, arrest to trial, 11 days, trial to sentence, 5 days. The report's tone resembled engineering documentation, emphasizing efficiency over emotion. At the FBI laboratory, the physical evidence was repackaged for long-term storage. Each detonator, ampoule and uniform fragment was cleaned, photographed and sealed in glass jars or envelopes. The items were placed in vault drawers labeled by exhibit number. An index card summarized each object's provenance and handling. The Bureau's archivists would later cite these materials as the most complete surviving collection of wartime sabotage equipment recovered on U.S. territory. Meanwhile, Berger and Dasch began their prison terms. Berger entered Leavenworth Penitentiary on August 15, 1942, listed as inmate number 28593L. Dasch arrived at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta 1 week later, number 46486A. Intake photographs show both men in standard gray uniforms, their expressions neutral. Their custody records list behavior as compliant, no disciplinary incidents. For the next 6 years they lived within the administrative rhythm of federal confinement. Work assignments, inspections, monthly reports and medical checks. During those years the war in Europe shifted irreversibly. German military fortunes declined, and by May 1945 the Third Reich had collapsed. The prisoners followed events through official bulletins and censored newspapers. The Bureau retained jurisdiction over their cases, maintaining correspondence with the War Department about possible post-war disposition. In 1946, Attorney General Tom C. Clark reviewed the files for clemency consideration. The memorandum he produced summarized the rationale for reduction. Both men had surrendered voluntarily and prevented acts of destruction. Continued imprisonment no longer served a military purpose. President Harry S. Truman reviewed the recommendations in early 1948. His executive order of April 30 granted conditional clemency to both men on the stipulation of immediate deportation to occupied Germany and prohibition of re-entry into the United States. The Department of Justice coordinated with the Army's European Command to arrange transfer. On June 3, 1948, Dasch and Berger were flown under escort from Washington National Airport to Frankfurt. Their arrival was recorded by American military authorities in the U.S. zone. Each signed documents acknowledging release, under specified conditions, restricted travel, monthly reporting to local occupation police, and prohibition of political activity. Their prison sentences were formally suspended. In Germany, their return attracted limited attention. Both lived quietly under observation. Dasch later attempted to publish an account of the operation titled 8 Spies Against America, using his own recollections and public records. The book appeared briefly in 1959, selling modestly before fading from circulation. Berger worked in clerical employment until his death in 1975. Neither man was prosecuted further. Their deportation closed the human chapter of Operation Pastorius. Back in Washington, the bureaucratic legacy continued to expand. Between 1943 and 1945, the Bureau compiled instructional bulletins using the case as a procedural template. Training seminars for new agents reenacted the timeline. Initial field detection, laboratory coordination, and centralized control. Visual aids included photographs of the Amagansett dunes and diagrams of the evidence chain. The case became doctrine, an exemplar of detection through vigilance and of rapid executive justice. By the 1950s, the files entered the National Archives under restricted classification. The original FBI case volumes, 63 binders of reports, photographs, and exhibits, were transferred to Record Group 65. The War Department's tribunal transcripts went to the Judge Advocate General's historical section. Each document received a new reference code and was microfilmed for preservation. Researchers could not access them for another 20 years. In 1960, the Department of Justice declassified selected materials for educational display. The Coast Guard Museum received the shovel recovered from Amagansett. The National Archives displayed one of the detonators and a sample of the currency found with the Saboteurs. Labels identified them only by exhibit number. Visitors saw objects without the human story that had produced them. The transition from event to artifact was complete. The legal precedent of ex parte quorum remained embedded in American jurisprudence. Law schools cited it in constitutional courses, military academies, and lectures on wartime authority. Each citation reduced the 8 saboteurs to a case name, a reference point for the reach of executive power. Over the decades, the decision resurfaced whenever the United States confronted issues of military justice and unlawful combatants. The practical memory of the men themselves receded behind the abstraction of legal principle. Within intelligence communities, Operation Pastorius remained a benchmark for counter-espionage efficiency. Internal histories produced by the Office of Strategic Services and later the Central Intelligence Agency cited it as evidence that domestic security measures could neutralize external threats through procedural rigor. Reports compared it to failed German operations in South America and Britain, noting that the United States had achieved total containment without public panic. The tone across these documents was administrative, rather than commemorative. As the Cold War matured, the archives of the case became material for classification review. By 1974, nearly all FBI documents on Operation Pastorius were declassified. Researchers analyzing them noted the extraordinary completeness of record-keeping. Every phone call, ticket receipt, and interrogation transcript preserved. The investigation's efficiency had become its memorial. At the Coast Guard station in Amagansett, a bronze plaque was installed in 1992, marking the location of the discovery. The text referred to the vigilance of a Coast Guardsman who thwarted enemy plans of sabotage during World War II. No names of saboteurs appeared. The site, once a wartime scene of secrecy and urgency, became a public historical landmark, visited by tourists. Each year, a wreath was placed on the anniversary of June 13. The ceremony lasted 10 minutes, conducted without speeches of condemnation or praise. It represented closure, in administrative form. In the end, Operation Pastorius produced more documents than acts. Its outcome was measured not in destruction, but in paperwork, arrest reports, tribunal transcripts, photographs, memoranda. The war it symbolized moved on to greater theaters, but the file persisted, complete and indexed. When archivists open the boxes today, they find a perfect chain of evidence, leading from sand to execution, from secrecy to law. The bureaucratic handwriting of 1942 remains legible, each line a mark of how the United States recorded its defense against invasion, not with combat, but with procedure. The final memorandum in the War Department's record, dated September 1948, closed the case formally. It read, "Subjects Dasch and Berger released and deported per presidential order. All others deceased per execution order. August 8, 1942. Case terminated." A clerk initialed the bottom corner and stamped it file complete. In that act of filing, Operation Pastorius ceased to exist as an active matter. What remained was structure, paper, numbering, and precedent. The system that had consumed the saboteurs outlived them, converting their failure into evidence of bureaucratic success. After 1948, Operation Pastorius ceased to exist as an active file. The 2 surviving prisoners had been flown out. the tribunal's records sealed, and the government's attention moved to reconstruction abroad and surveillance at home. Yet the infrastructure of classification ensured continuation in silence. The materials, evidence crates, bound transcripts, photographic negatives, were not destroyed, but reassigned to long-term custody. The Bureau's archives stored them under climate control, arranged by numeric code rather than title. In quarterly inventories, the case appeared as a line of digits, with the notation inactive. No reference to sabotage, espionage, or Germany was needed. The numbers were sufficient. The agencies involved dispersed their personnel. Agents who had conducted arrests transferred to new divisions, investigating industrial security, draft evasion, or later, communist infiltration. Naval officers rotated to Pacific assignments. Coast Guard stations resumed coastal patrols. The small wooden building at Amagansett was demobilized, its watch logs boxed for federal storage. By 1950, the dune where the explosives had been buried was eroding, reshaped by wind and tides. Photographs taken by the Army Map Service show the beach line 40 yards inland from its 1942 position. Nature erased the visible trace, while the paper record remained exact. The Cold War bureaucracy that replaced wartime urgency depended on precedent. Operation Pastorius became citation rather than memory. The decision in ex parte querin entered legal handbooks, indexed between other emergency rulings. Law clerks reading the paragraph saw 8 names reduced to initials and docket numbers. In classrooms, professors summarized the case in one sentence: proof that unlawful combatants could be tried by military commission. The reference reproduced itself across decades, moving farther from the coastal night that created it. In 1958, the Bureau transferred duplicate negatives of the evidence photographs to the National Archives' new building on Pennsylvania Avenue. A brief memorandum accompanied the delivery. Historic materials. Espionage case, 1942. Archivist logged the contents, replaced original envelopes with acid-free sleeves, and stored them in temperature-controlled vaults. Each photograph received an accession number, beginning with 6542. The images show the uniform fragments, the detonators, and the sand depression under early morning light. The human figures were cropped out. Viewers decades later would see only objects arranged on tables, labeled with tags written in fountain pen ink. By the 1960s, those who had witnessed the trial retired. Generals McCoy, Grant, and Gasser died within years of each other. Their papers entered university archives, where researchers found carbon copies of military memoranda and personal diaries, noting the tribunal sessions in restrained language. One entry reads, "All proceedings orderly, men composed." The handwriting is small, deliberate, administrative. None of the participants ever publicly recounted the events in detail. The secrecy oath remained unbroken. The transformation of the episode into history proceeded through government summaries. In 1961, the Department of Defense compiled Historical Studies of Military Justice No. 1, devoting 8 pages to the Saboteur trial. The text lists dates, charges, and outcomes. The language is passive, free of adjectives. The study's purpose was to establish process, not narrative. Its distribution was limited to military law courses. Readers encountering it saw procedure without atmosphere, just the machinery of command executing itself correctly. At Amagansett, coastal development began to alter the landscape. Private houses appeared where wartime dunes had stood. The former life-saving station, abandoned in 1947, was sold to local authorities for use as storage. For 20 years it stood empty, its paint peeling, its roof sagging in salt wind. In the 1970s, preservation groups restored it and petitioned for historical recognition. Their documentation drew on declassified FBI material, citing the patrolman's report and the photographs of recovered crates. In 1987, the site was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The entry contained precise coordinates, the same that had once marked the landing zone on military charts. Each new decade brought a smaller form of remembrance. Newspapers printed anniversary features, summarizing the case in neutral tone. 1942, 8 Nazi saboteurs captured before completing mission. Writers reused government phrasing. No new facts emerged, only the rhythm of rediscovery. Repeated, when the Cold War ended, historians re-examined declassified intelligence files. They confirmed that Berlin had never attempted another insertion, and that the Abwehr had collapsed before war's end. Operation Pastorius remained unique, defined as failure in every strategic analysis. In 1990, surviving administrative correspondence from the original investigation were identified. A few letters surfaced in private collections, routine acknowledgments, never personal reflections. The language was consistent across them. As per instructions, attached for reference, file and destroy after reading. The bureaucracy that had recorded every minute of the operation had left no sentences of emotion or opinion. Its self-description was pure function. By the late 20th century, the remaining participants were gone. Dasch died in Germany in 1992, unnoticed outside small obituaries, citing him as the man who betrayed Hitler's saboteurs. His burial site carried no reference to the war. Berger had died earlier, in 1975. His death certificate noting clerk, retired. No German records linked them to military service. Their names reappeared only when historians cross-referenced US and German files, aligning identities through birth dates and fingerprints. In 1992, the 50th anniversary of the landings, the US Coast Guard commissioned a commemorative marker at the Amagansett station. The bronze plaque summarized events in 70 words, concluding with, "Through alertness and duty, a threat to the homeland was averted." The dedication ceremony lasted 15 minutes. Local officials attended. No federal representatives were present. Photographs show a small crowd standing beside dunes under overcast sky, the ocean barely visible beyond. The simplicity of the gesture matched the institutional silence that had followed the case for half a century. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, academic research returned to the tribunal as a study in wartime law. Declassified transcripts allowed historians to reconstruct each session, minute by minute. They noted the precision of the questioning, the strict evidence protocol, and the absence of recorded emotion. Analyses concluded that the commission functioned more like an administrative audit than a courtroom. The efficiency admired in 1942 became, in later commentary, a subject of ethical debate. Yet even criticism remained confined to scholarship. Public memory stayed limited to the single plaque and a handful of exhibits. The digital era converted the paper record into scanned images. In 2002, the National Archives digitized the FBI's case volumes, converting thousands of pages into searchable files. Users reading them online encountered the same structure preserved since 1942. Memorandum headers, serial numbers, and marginal initials. The clarity of reproduction amplified the impersonal tone. The documents gave no sense of night air, surf, or human presence. Only sequential evidence that the event had been processed to completion. Occasionally, parallels to later national security cases revived interest. Each time, journalists revisited ex parte query as precedent. Legal commentary described the saboteur trial as the template for executive wartime tribunals. The historical distance reduced the 8 men to case law, their execution to citation. The mechanics of bureaucracy had transformed their lives into footnotes to governance. The physical remnants continued to disperse. The explosives and detonators were destroyed in the 1950s under ordnance disposal orders. The uniforms decayed in storage and were eventually discarded. Only the shovel, some acid ampoules, and a few labeled fragments survived in museum custody. The wooden crates collapsed from humidity. Curators salvaged small sections for preservation. The reduction of artifacts mirrored the erosion of memory. Objects once guarded as evidence became exhibits, then curiosities. At the former district jail, new buildings covered the ground where the executions took place. Records of burial sites were incomplete. Maintenance maps showed only a shaded rectangle labeled Former Cemetery, decommissioned 1946. No marker identified the graves. In that absence, the story's physical endpoint vanished into the city's infrastructure. The bureaucracy that had once described everything now preserved its own forgetting. The Coast Guard continued routine patrols along Long Island through the century's end. The Amagansett station became a museum, its displays consisting of patrol logs, a uniform, and enlarged photographs from 1942. Visitors walked through reconstructed rooms, arranged as dioramas. A caption beneath the patrolman's portrait read simply, "Vigilance prevented sabotage." The man who had filed the original report had died decades earlier. His descendants donated his whistle and flashlight for display. The objects, suspended behind glass, embodied the institutional ideal of watchfulness, procedure elevated to virtue. By the 21st century, Operation Pastorius existed entirely as archive and law. The living witnesses had been replaced by files, citations, and replicas. Scholars consulting the materials encountered an unbroken record of competence, agencies responding, systems functioning, justice delivered. Nothing in the files suggested uncertainty or hesitation. The cumulative effect was antiseptic completeness, the sense of a nation defending itself through paperwork, executed flawlessly. Occasionally, the National Archives received requests from filmmakers or researchers seeking personal angles, letters, photographs, last statements. The replies were uniform. No personal correspondence located. The absence of private material defined the case. The system had absorbed every trace of individuality into procedure. The saboteurs, their captors, the prosecutors, and the guards All survived only as names typed in courier font. Today, the record rests in quiet vaults measured at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 40% humidity. Metal shelving holds the boxes. Fluorescent lights flicker briefly when archivists enter. Each folder remains in numerical order, each page counted and stamped. The case number, once urgent, is now historic metadata. Visitors sign request slips, view the files, and return them to shelves. The paper emits a faint chemical odor of age. The ink still dark, the bureaucratic sentences still precise. The dunes at Amagansett continue to shift. Satellite imagery shows the shoreline advancing inland by a few meters each decade. The marker remains upright near the restored life-saving station, its bronze surface dulled by salt air. Occasionally, school groups visit, guided by local historians who recount the night of 1942 in summary phrases. The wind carries the words away into the surf. Beyond the station, the Atlantic remains featureless, the water closing over coordinates where U-22 once surfaced. Nothing visible remains, except the plaque, the tide, and the paperwork stored hundreds of miles inland. In the end, silence became the case's final form. No monuments, larger than a plaque, no public debates, no survivors' memoirs widely read. The system that had moved swiftly to eradicate a threat achieved total control, not through spectacle, but through record-keeping. The machinery of law and intelligence folded the event into itself, leaving only documentation. Decades later, that documentation endures as proof, less of what happened than of how the United States recorded what happened. The Saboteurs' failure became a demonstration of bureaucratic permanence. The beaches eroded, the uniforms decayed, the participants died, yet the files remained exact, paginated and silent. In the early 21st century, Operation Pastorius existed entirely as digital record and legal precedent. The transition from classified report to public document had taken half a century, moving through carbon copies, microfilm, and scanned image files. The data resided on secure government servers, indexed by accession number, each page coded in metadata for retrieval. The story's original tension, submarines, explosives, and war had long dissolved into archival maintenance. What survived was a perfect bureaucratic ecosystem, cataloging, cross-referencing, and redundancy. Historians, lawyers, and intelligence officers still cited it. Law reviews revisited ex parte query, each time the United States confronted new categories of enemy, first during the Cold War, then after September 11, 2001. The same language drafted in 1942 appeared in new memoranda, describing military commissions for modern conflicts. In hearings, lawyers invoked the Saboteur case as the foundation of authority. The tone remained unchanged, objective, procedural, and certain. Each new citation carried the bureaucratic rhythm of its origin, the sound of an agency describing its own competence. Within agencies, the operations files served as a cautionary model. Counterintelligence manuals referred to it as an example of total interdiction. Through administrative coordination, training modules reproduced photographs of the Long Island cache, explaining chain of custody protocols that had become standard procedure across decades. The names of the saboteurs were rarely mentioned. What mattered was structure, observation, report, investigation, control. The human elements, the patrolmen, the suspects, the interrogators, had become secondary to the mechanism that processed them. By the 2010s, researchers accessing the FBI's digital reading room found the Pastorius documents embedded among thousands of other declassified cases. Each appeared identical in interface, a list of PDF icons, file sizes, and date stamps. Clicking one opened a grainy reproduction of typewritten pages. Readers scrolling through encountered a rhythm of bureaucratic prose that never varied. Every page ended with signatures, initials, and distribution lists. The uniformity erased distinctions between espionage, theft, and sabotage. All events became text, flattened into the same administrative language. Occasional interest surfaced in public media. Documentaries portrayed the story as a brief wartime episode, emphasizing the Coast Guard patrolmen's vigilance and the FBI's rapid response. Narrators spoke over archival footage of beaches, submarines, and city streets. The editing reproduced the procedural tempo of the original investigation, chronological, unembellished, and precise. The tone remained factual, the narration clean of speculation. The story's power derived not from drama, but from the quiet inevitability of bureaucracy at work. Legal historians noted the paradox. A failed operation that produced enduring authority. 8 men had landed with explosives and accomplished nothing, yet their capture reshaped American law for generations. The military tribunal, conducted behind locked doors, became a cornerstone for later wartime jurisprudence. Its secrecy, once pragmatic, evolved into a principle. Each future invocation of Quirin extended the reach of executive process into new eras. The law remembered the structure more faithfully than the event itself. At the Coast Guard Museum, The surviving artifacts remain sealed in display cases. The shovel and acid ampoules sat under soft light, accompanied by small text panels describing their recovery. Visitors paused briefly, read the captions, and moved on to other exhibits. The objects emitted no story, only presence. The narrative depended entirely on the institutional text beside them. Every detail of the mission had been reduced to exhibit labels measured in sentences. Beyond the glass, the Atlantic continued its indifferent rhythm outside the museum walls. In classrooms, students studying American wartime law read about the case through excerpts of court decisions and government memoranda. The saboteurs appeared as initials: HH, EB, GD. Their biographies truncated into bullet points. Professors discussed due process, presidential power, and the boundaries of jurisdiction. No one mentioned the fog on the beach, the smell of diesel, or the weight of sand over buried explosives. Those sensory realities had been erased by the perfection of documentation. The administrative record had absorbed all atmosphere. The remaining physical traces continued their slow decay. The wooden remains of the original Amagansett life-saving station were restored as a museum, its interior reconstructed from photographs. Visitors could view the patrol log open to June 13, 1942. The handwriting on the page, darkened by age, recorded the moment of discovery in a single line. Cited 4 men on beach, suspicious. The simplicity of the sentence condensed the entire operation into 6 words. Above the logbook, a framed placard explained the outcome in the vocabulary of official history: detection, investigation, conviction. The human act of observation had become permanent through the endurance of its paperwork. In the archives, the Pastorius file continues to follow the same schedule of preservation audits as all other federal records. Every 5 years, archivists verify humidity, inspect binding, and log the results in spreadsheets. The boxes remain in deep storage, uniform unlabeled, to casual observers. Only catalog numbers distinguish one history from another. The archivists themselves handle the material with neutrality. For them, the file represents one case among many, significant only for its completeness. The emotional charge of espionage or execution has long since evaporated. What remains is data integrity. Occasionally, researchers discover new details in marginal notes, handwritten corrections, initials, or small discrepancies between typed pages. These anomalies, once inconsequential, now attract analysis. Scholars study them not for revelation, but for texture, evidence of the human hand within the bureaucratic fabric. The act of typing, the misaligned letter, the ink blot, each becomes proof of presence. Through such imperfections, the machinery of record reveals its operators. In the absence of living witnesses, the documents themselves have become the last surviving participants. Outside the institutional frameworks, the event's memory is minimal. Local histories of Long Island devote a paragraph to it. Encyclopedias summarize it in 3 sentences. The beach has long been rebuilt for tourism, the dunes stabilized by vegetation. Signs mark the general area, though exact coordinates have shifted under new sand. Visitors walking the shoreline see nothing unusual, just a plaque on a railing and the unbroken horizon. The scene's tranquility conceals its history, just as the files conceal their human context. Silence remains the dominant feature of both. For intelligence historians, Operation Pastorius represents the transition from personal espionage to bureaucratic counterintelligence. It illustrates the moment when individual initiative gave way to procedural systems, where observation became protocol and action became paperwork. The 8 saboteurs existed as agents only briefly. Within weeks, they were evidence, then subjects, then file numbers. Their failure helped create the modern architecture of surveillance that endures across wars. The state's ability to detect, analyze, and neutralize threats evolved directly from the mechanisms refined in 1942. The process proved more durable than any ideology. In that sense, the legacy of Pastorius is not destruction or heroism, but continuity. The systems that recorded it never stopped functioning. They expanded, from Coast Guard patrol logs, to FBI case files, to digital databases. Each layer of observation replicated itself into new technology. The language of vigilance, observe, report, verify, remains unchanged. The same procedural lexicon that described footprints in the sand now describes data packets and digital traces. The operation's essence survives not in memory, but in process. Modern investigators, studying counter-espionage, recognize the file as origin point. Its structure, incident, evidence, confession, confirmation, became the template for domestic threat management. The pattern repeats in later decades, under new names. The efficiency that defined the 1942 investigation became the metric for every subsequent one. Bureaucracy learned from itself and never forgot. For the families of those involved, the event remained peripheral. Descendants of the saboteurs received no restitution, no formal acknowledgement. Descendants of officials or guards rarely spoke of it. The generations that followed inherited documentation, but no stories. Each record's impersonal tone prevented emotional transmission. The operation existed only in archives, where curiosity replaced connection. In national history, the case occupies a thin column between larger events, Pearl Harbor before it, Normandy after. Its duration was brief, its outcome predetermined by competence. Yet it persists because it demonstrates a system functioning perfectly. Detection, response, adjudication, elimination. For a bureaucracy built on reliability, Pastorius remains the ideal example. An operation concluded without uncertainty, without remainder, without deviation from protocol. As the 21st century progresses, the digital archive replaces the physical. The pages scanned into databases preserve the texture of paper, but not its weight. The metadata, date created, file size, checksum, becomes the new version of authorship. Every document carries a timestamp confirming its authenticity, replicating the old signatures in a new medium. Future archivists monitor bit integrity instead of ink preservation. The form changes, the principle remains. The system still guards its own memory. The beaches remain empty. The ocean that once hid U-22 continues its indifferent rhythm, erasing traces faster than history can record them. In satellite images, the shoreline appears smooth, timeless, unmarked by human intrusion. Only the coordinates and digital archives connect this landscape to its past. The distance between place and record has grown absolute. In the end, Operation Pastorius became not an episode of war, but an illustration of how a state remembers. The event proved that the machinery of documentation can outlive everything it describes. Every person involved, saboteur, guard, agent, prosecutor, has vanished. Yet their actions remain recoverable through serial numbers and cross-referenced files. The bureaucracy preserved itself through their disappearance. Inside a secure vault in the National Archives, one box still bears the original label typed in 1942, Pastorius. Complete. The paper is yellowed, the staples rusting, the contents perfectly ordered. Within those pages, the sequence repeats endlessly. Observation, discovery, arrest, judgment, execution. Beyond the vault, the world continues in silence, sustained by the same procedural logic that recorded its own vigilance.